Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The key felt heavier than it should have in my palm, its brass surface cold despite the October sun beating down on my shoulders. I stood before Grandma Eleanor's weathered colonial, its white paint peeling like old skin, and wondered why I'd driven 6 hours from Portland to this forgotten corner of Maine. The realtor's offer sat folded in my jacket pocket, a generous sum from Hartwell Development Company, enough to pay off the mortgage and secure my family's future. But as I turned the key and stepped across the threshold, the familiar scent of lavender and old wood couldn't mask something else lurking beneath. Something that made my nostrils flare and my throat tighten. Damp earth. The kind that clings to cemetery soil after rain. The house felt smaller than I remembered, as if the walls had crept inward during the 5 years since Grandma's funeral. I set my overnight bag by the door and walked through rooms that had once felt like sanctuaries. Now they seemed to watch me, their shadows deeper than they should be in the afternoon light. Through the kitchen window, I could see the backyard stretching toward the tree line, where the old colonial cemetery began. The wrought iron fence had collapsed in several places, and headstones jutted from the earth like broken teeth. As a kid, my cousins and I had treated it as our private playground, racing between the graves and inventing elaborate games of hide-and-seek among the weathered monuments. We'd pressed our faces against the oldest stones, trying to decipher names worn smooth by centuries of New England winters. The memory should have brought warmth, but instead, a chill crawled up my spine. I pulled my phone from my pocket and called Sarah. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the comfortable chaos of our evening routine. I could hear the clatter of dishes and the familiar hum of our refrigerator in the background. "How's the house?" she asked, and I could picture her tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear the way she always did when she was distracted. "Smaller than I remember," I said, walking to the window. But the realtor wasn't kidding about the property value. The land alone is worth more than I expected. That's good news, right? We could use the money. I should have agreed. Should have told her about the generous offer burning a hole in my pocket. Instead, I found myself staring at the cemetery, where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows between the headstones. Something moved among them, a darkness that didn't quite fit the geometry of shade and stone. "Right," I said finally. "Good news." After we hung up, I tried to focus on the practical matters. I walked through each room, making mental notes of what needed to be done before the sale. The upstairs bedrooms were stuffy but clean, their hardwood floors creaking under my feet with the same sounds I remembered from childhood sleepovers. The bathroom fixtures were outdated but functional. The basement smelled of sawdust and motor oil, exactly as it had when Grandpa tinkered with his woodworking projects. But as the sun began to set, the house's familiar comfort eroded. The shadows lengthened and deepened, and I found myself listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. The creak of floorboards in empty rooms, the whisper of wind through windows that were closed, the distant chiming of bells, though the nearest church was 3 miles away. I made myself a sandwich from supplies I'd brought and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, my eyes drawn repeatedly to the window. The cemetery was invisible now, swallowed by darkness, but I could feel its presence like a weight pressing against the glass. When I finally forced myself to go upstairs, I chose the guest room rather than my old bedroom. Something about sleeping in the same space where I'd once dreamed of adventures among the headstones felt wrong now, tainted by an unease I couldn't name. I lay in the narrow bed, listening to the house settle around me. The familiar sounds of expanding wood and cooling metal should have been comforting, but they seemed different now, more deliberate, as if the house were trying to communicate something urgent. Sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of running through the cemetery while invisible hands grasped at my ankles. I woke several times, my heart pounding, convinced I'd heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. But when I crept to the door and pressed my ear against the wood, I heard only the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sigh of wind through the trees. The next morning brought no relief. I stood in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee and staring at the Hartwell development contract on the table. The numbers were generous, more than generous. They wanted to break ground on a luxury subdivision within 6 months, complete with a clubhouse and golf course. The old cemetery would be relocated, the headstones carefully moved to a memorial garden in the town center. It was a practical solution, a profitable one. But as I read the details, my left forearm began to itch. I pushed up my sleeve and found a mark I didn't remember, a bruise about the size of a quarter, deep purple against my pale skin. It looked like a thumbprint, as if someone had gripped my arm with unusual force. I must have bumped it while carrying boxes, I told myself. Or maybe I'd knocked it against the car door. These things happened. But the mark seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, and when I touched it, the skin felt cold despite the warmth of the morning sun streaming through the window. I spent the rest of the morning walking through the house, taking inventory and trying to ignore the growing unease in my chest. The mark on my arm had darkened, and now I could swear I felt others, invisible hands pressing against my shoulders, my back, my neck. Every time I turned around, the sensation vanished, but the memory of that cold touch lingered. In the afternoon, I decided to walk the property line, telling myself it was due diligence. The realtor needed accurate measurements for the survey, and I might as well make myself useful. The cemetery was smaller than I remembered, perhaps 3 dozen headstones scattered across a plot no bigger than a suburban backyard. The oldest graves dated to the 1680s, their slate markers so weathered that most of the inscriptions were illegible. A few newer stones from the 1800s stood in better condition, their granite surfaces still sharp enough to read names and dates. As I walked among them, my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud. The autumn leaves crunched under my feet with sounds that echoed longer than they should have. I found myself stepping carefully, avoiding the sunken areas where the earth had settled over the years. Near the center of the cemetery, I stopped at a headstone that had always fascinated me as a child. It was larger than the others, carved from black granite that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The inscription was simple. Here lies Thomas Whitmore, 1654-1712. May his rest be undisturbed. I'd always wondered about that last line. Most colonial headstones carried religious sentiments or brief epitaphs about the deceased's virtues. But Thomas Whitmore's marker seemed to carry a warning. As I stood there, the mark on my arm began to throb. I rolled up my sleeve and found that it had spread, becoming a dark stain that stretched from my wrist to my elbow. The skin felt ice-cold and slightly numb, as if circulation had been cut off. A sudden gust of wind swept through the cemetery, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something organic and unpleasant. I breathed through my mouth and stepped back from the headstone, but the smell seemed to follow me. That evening, I called the local historical society from Grandma's landline. The woman who answered spoke in the careful, measured tones of someone who'd fielded similar questions before. She told me about Thomas Whitmore, how he'd been the settlement's first minister, but had fallen from grace after accusations of practicing folk magic. He'd been buried in the cemetery despite opposition from some townspeople, who'd wanted his body taken elsewhere. Strange things had happened afterward: livestock dying, crops failing, people reporting nightmares and visions. Of course, those were different times, she said, her voice carrying the slight condescension of someone discussing primitive superstitions. People were more susceptible to mass hysteria. But after I hung up, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. I searched through Grandma's bookshelves and found her collection of local histories, their pages yellow with age and brittle to the touch. In a volume published in 1923, I found a chapter titled The Whitmore Incident that the Historical Society woman had failed to mention. According to the author, the strange occurrences had continued for nearly 30 years after Thomas Whitmore's death, until a town elder named Ezra Blackwood had performed some kind of ritual to bind the restless spirit. The ritual had worked, apparently. The strange deaths had stopped, and the cemetery had been left undisturbed. But the book included a warning. Should the burial ground be desecrated or the remains disturbed, The binding may fail, and the old troubles may return. I read the passage 3 times, my pulse quickening with each repetition. The mark on my arm had spread further, reaching from my shoulder to my fingertips. The skin had taken on a mottled appearance, as if blood were pooling beneath the surface. When I tried to call Sarah, the phone rang and rang without answer. I checked my cell phone and found no signal bars, though I'd had full coverage that morning. The landline crackled with static, and I thought I could hear voices whispering in the background, words I couldn't quite make out, spoken in a language that sounded like English, but somehow wasn't. I hung up and walked to the window. The cemetery was invisible in the darkness, but I could feel its presence like a living thing. The temperature in the house seemed to drop with each passing minute, and my breath began to form small clouds in the air. The sound of bells started just after midnight, a slow, mournful tolling that seemed to come from directly outside the house. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the back porch, its beam cutting through the darkness in a narrow cone that revealed nothing but empty air. But the bells continued, and now I could hear other sounds beneath them. Footsteps on dry leaves, the scrape of stone against stone, whispers that might have been wind through the trees, or might have been something else entirely. I wanted to go back inside, to lock the door and wait for morning. But the mark on my arm had begun to burn, and I knew with sudden certainty that running wouldn't solve anything. Whatever was happening here, it was connected to the cemetery, to Thomas Whitmore, and to the development company's plans. I walked toward the headstones, my flashlight beam dancing across weathered marble and granite. The bells grew louder with each step, joined by other sounds, the creak of ropes, the whisper of cloth, the soft thud of earth hitting wood. At Thomas Whitmore's grave, I stopped. The ground around the headstone had changed. What had been level earth that morning was now a depression, as if something beneath the surface was slowly sinking. The black granite marker leaned at an angle, and I could see gaps in the soil where the earth had pulled away from the stone. The mark on my arm pulsed in rhythm with the bells, and I understood with horrible clarity what was happening. The cemetery wasn't just home to the dead. It was a prison, carefully constructed and maintained for nearly 3 centuries. And the development company's plans would destroy it, just as surely as if they'd taken a sledgehammer to the walls of a maximum security facility. I thought of Sarah and our son, safe in our house 6 hours away. I thought of the generous offer in my pocket, the financial security it would bring. I thought of the alternative, leaving the cemetery undisturbed, keeping the secrets buried with Thomas Whitmore and whoever else lay beneath the weathered stones. The bells reached a crescendo, and I felt invisible hands gripping my arm, my shoulder, my neck. The marks that had been spreading across my skin burned like fire, and I knew that if I left now, if I signed the contract and let the developers tear up the ground, the binding would fail completely. But I also knew that the marks weren't random. They were a message, a warning, a countdown. Each day I delayed, each night I stayed in the house, they would spread further. Eventually they would reach my heart, and whatever force had been contained in the cemetery would have a new vessel, a new way to reach beyond the boundaries of its prison. I turned off the flashlight and stood in the darkness, listening to the bells and the whispers and the sound of my own ragged breathing. The choice was simple, really. I could save my family by sacrificing the town, or I could save the town by sacrificing myself. Or maybe there was a third option. Maybe Ezra Blackwood's ritual could be performed again, the binding renewed for another generation. Maybe the cemetery could be preserved, disguised as a historical landmark or a nature preserve. Maybe the development company could be convinced to build elsewhere. But as I stood there in the darkness, feeling the cold fingers of the dead pressing against my skin, I realized that the choice might not be mine to make. The marks had spread to my chest now, and I could feel them reaching toward my heart with each beat. Whatever Thomas Whitmore had been in life, whatever he'd become in death, he was patient. He'd waited 3 centuries for his chance, and he wouldn't be denied by the practical concerns of a man trying to provide for his family. The bells began to fade, and the invisible hands released their grip. I walked back to the house on unsteady legs, my flashlight beam wavering ahead of me. Inside, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the contract until the words blurred together. When morning came, I would make the call. I would tell someone, Sarah, the realtor, the historical society, about what I'd learned. I would find a way to stop the development, to preserve the cemetery and keep the binding intact. But even as I made these plans, I could feel the marks spreading across my chest, creeping toward my heart like frost on a window. And I wondered if I was making a choice at all, or if the choice was being made for me by forces that had been waiting in the earth for longer than I could imagine. The sun was beginning to rise when I finally closed my eyes, and in the growing light, I thought I could see figures moving among the headstones. Not quite solid, not quite gone, but something in between. They seemed to be watching the house, waiting for something, waiting for me. I pulled the contract toward me across the table and reached for a pen. But as my fingers closed around it, the marks on my arm pulsed once, and I knew that whatever I decided, it was already too late for all of us. Story 2. The night shift at Willowbrook Psychiatric Hospital had a particular weight to it, a heaviness that seemed to press against your chest until breathing became a conscious effort. I'd been working there for 3 months, long enough to recognize the building's peculiar rhythm, the way fluorescent lights hummed in different keys down each corridor, how the heating system groaned like something in pain, and the almost imperceptible shift in air pressure that occurred precisely at 3:33 a.m. That's when I first noticed him. Room 237 housed Marcus Holloway, a Vietnam veteran admitted 2 weeks prior for what the files euphemistically called severe post-traumatic stress disorder with dissociative episodes. The man barely spoke during the day, spending hours staring at his hands or the gray linoleum tiles, occasionally muttering fragments about jungle sounds and falling rain. Standard presentation, according to Dr. Reeves, who'd seen dozens of cases like his. But nothing was standard about what happened when the clock struck 3:33. I was making my rounds that first night when I heard it, a sound like air being slowly released from a balloon, coming from Marcus's room. Through the reinforced glass window, I watched his pupils dilate until they consumed his entire iris, transforming his eyes into perfect black circles that somehow managed to reflect light like polished amber. The effect was mesmerizing and deeply wrong, as if I were looking at something that shouldn't exist within the confines of human anatomy. Marcus sat perfectly still during these episodes, his breathing so shallow it barely moved his chest. The dilation would last exactly 7 minutes, then snap back to normal as if someone had flipped a switch. He'd blink once, twice, then return to his usual vacant stare, apparently unaware that anything had occurred. I mentioned it to Dr. Reeves the next morning, describing the optical phenomenon as precisely as I could. He nodded with the distracted air of someone who'd heard similar reports before, scribbling notes that I suspected would never be reviewed. Stress response, he said without looking up from his clipboard. The pupils react to internal stimuli, memories, nightmares, chemical imbalances, nothing unusual for his condition. But I knew what I'd seen, and it wasn't a stress response. The second night, I positioned myself outside Marcus's room at 3:30 a.m., notepad ready to document everything. The hospital's atmosphere seemed different in those pre-dawn hours, thicker somehow, as if the air itself had become viscous. The usual background noise of the building faded to an almost complete silence, broken only by the distant hum of the ventilation system and the occasional creak of settling infrastructure. At 3:33 exactly, it began. This time I noticed details I'd missed before. The temperature in the corridor dropped several degrees, enough that I could see my breath in brief, ghostly puffs. The fluorescent light above Marcus's room flickered in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. 3 short pulses, followed by 3 long ones, then 3 short again. SOS. Marcus's transformation was more dramatic than I'd remembered. His pupils didn't just dilate, they seemed to deepen, becoming wells of absolute darkness that reflected that strange amber light from somewhere within. His breathing stopped entirely for several seconds, and when it resumed, it came in measured intervals that didn't match any natural respiratory pattern. That's when I heard the sound from the intercom. It started as static, the kind of electronic whisper that might indicate a loose connection or interference. But as I listened, the noise resolved into something more structured. Dots and dashes, transmitted in the old Morse code I'd learned during my brief stint in the Coast Guard Reserves. GATE. The message repeated 3 times, then faded back to static before falling silent. I checked my watch. 3:40 a.m. Marcus's eyes had returned to normal, and he was blinking in that confused, disoriented way that followed each episode. I spent the rest of my shift trying to rationalize what I'd experienced. Old buildings had electrical problems. Morse code was probably just a pattern my brain had imposed on random interference. The temperature fluctuation could be explained by the ancient heating system. The timing was coincidental. But I couldn't explain the certainty I felt that something had been watching me through Marcus's transformed eyes. By the 3rd night, I developed a theory. Vietnam veterans often experienced what researchers called temporal displacement, moments when their consciousness seemed to slip back to specific traumatic events. Perhaps Marcus's episodes weren't random breaks from reality, but connections to something that had happened at 3:33 a.m. in a jungle somewhere, decades ago. The gate message might be a call sign, a location, or even a person's name. I arrived at his room early, bringing a small digital recorder and my phone's camera. If I could document the phenomenon properly, maybe Dr. Reeves would take it seriously. Maybe someone could help Marcus break free from whatever held him in its grip. The corridor felt different that night, more alive somehow, as if the walls themselves were breathing. The air moved in subtle currents that carried no scent, but somehow suggested vast, dark spaces beyond the confines of the building. I positioned myself at the observation window and waited. 3:33 a.m. arrived with the precision of a conductor's baton. The temperature plummeted so suddenly that frost began forming on the glass. My breath came in visible clouds, and I could hear my heartbeat accelerating in response to the sudden cold. Marcus's transformation began immediately, that impossible pupil dilation that turned his eyes into amber-lit abysses. But this time, something was different. This time, he was looking directly at me, his head turned with mechanical precision until his gaze fixed on mine through the window. The amber light in his eyes intensified, and I felt something probing at the edges of my consciousness, a presence that was ancient and patient and utterly inhuman. My digital recorder emitted a high-pitched whine before shutting off completely. My phone's screen flickered with static, then went black. The intercom crackled to life. GATE, GATE, GATE. Then, in a voice that wasn't quite Marcus's, something spoke through the system. Thank you for watching. Thank you for opening. Thank you for inviting. The connection between us felt like a physical thing, a bridge of consciousness that spanned the glass and the distance between us. Through it, I caught glimpses of something vast and patient, something that had been waiting for someone to notice, to pay attention, to create the necessary link. I stumbled backward, breaking eye contact, and immediately felt the oppressive weight lift from my chest. The temperature returned to normal, the lights stopped flickering, and Marcus's eyes snapped back to their usual vacant stare. But I knew something had changed. In that moment of connection, something had passed between us, or rather, something had passed from him to me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel that presence lurking at the edges of my consciousness, patient and persistent. During the day, I found myself checking mirrors obsessively, searching for signs of that amber light in my own pupils. I avoided eye contact with colleagues, afraid of what they might see looking back at them. The rational part of my mind insisted that I was experiencing some form of stress-induced psychosis. The isolation of night shift work, the oppressive atmosphere of the psychiatric hospital, the disturbing nature of Marcus's condition, all of it could combine to create hallucinations and paranoid delusions. I'd seen it happen to other staff members who'd worked the ward too long without proper rest. But rationality became harder to maintain when I realized that I knew things I shouldn't know. During Marcus's intake evaluation, I found myself recalling details that weren't in his file. I knew that he'd been a radio operator in Vietnam, that he'd been stationed near the Cambodian border, that he'd been the sole survivor of an ambush that had occurred at 3:33 a.m. local time. I knew that Gate had been his unit's call sign, and that he'd spent his last night in the jungle transmitting SOS messages that no one had answered. More disturbing still, I knew that something had answered from the other side. By the fourth night, I'd made a decision. I would confront whatever was happening directly. If I was losing my mind, at least I'd know for certain. If something supernatural was occurring, I'd document it properly and find a way to help Marcus and myself break free. I arrived at his room with a different kind of preparation. I'd researched grounding techniques, protective visualizations, and even brought a small religious medallion that had belonged to my grandmother. If this was psychological, the rituals might help stabilize my mind. If it was something else, perhaps they'd provide actual protection. The familiar pre-episode atmosphere began building around 3:30 a.m. The air thickened, the temperature dropped, and the building's background noise faded to that oppressive silence. But this time, I was ready. When Marcus's eyes began their transformation, I maintained steady eye contact while mentally constructing barriers around my consciousness. I visualized walls of light, repeated protective phrases, and gripped the medallion until its edges cut into my palm. The amber light in his eyes intensified, and I felt that probing presence push against my mental defenses. But instead of invasion, I sensed something else. Desperation. The thing behind Marcus's eyes wasn't malevolent so much as lost, trapped in a cycle of reaching out for connection that had been repeating for decades. Through the strange link between us, I glimpsed Marcus's last night in Vietnam. He'd been alone in his radio bunker when the attack came, desperately calling for help that never arrived. In his final moments, something had heard his transmission. Not his commanding officers, but something that existed in the spaces between radio frequencies, in the electromagnetic gaps where signals sometimes disappeared. It had kept him alive, but at a cost. Every night at 3:33 a.m., he became a conduit for its attempts to reach our reality. It needed human consciousness as a bridge, a way to anchor itself in our world. For decades, it had been patient, waiting for someone to notice, to pay attention, to create the necessary connection. I was that someone. The revelation should have terrified me, but instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. Marcus had been carrying this burden alone for decades, trapped in an endless cycle of supernatural contact. The thing that used him as a conduit wasn't evil, it was simply lost, seeking a way back to wherever it had come from. As the episode ended and Marcus's eyes returned to normal, I made my decision. I would help him break the cycle, not by running from it, but by understanding it. If I could find a way to communicate with the entity, perhaps I could help it find what it was looking for. Perhaps I could free Marcus from his role as an unwilling medium. Over the following weeks, I spent my nights researching electromagnetic phenomena, radio history, and the physics of consciousness. I studied accounts of similar cases, learned about the theoretical frameworks that might explain interdimensional contact, and gradually developed a plan. The entity communicated through electromagnetic fields, using Marcus's altered consciousness as a receiver. If I could create a more suitable conduit, a technological bridge instead of a human one, perhaps I could redirect its attention away from Marcus and toward a solution that didn't require a human host. I began bringing equipment to the hospital: radio receivers, electromagnetic field detectors, and a laptop computer programmed with software that could interpret radio signals as digital data. If the entity was trying to communicate, I would give it a more appropriate medium. The experiment began on a Tuesday night in late October. I positioned my equipment around Marcus's room and waited for 3:33 a.m. When the familiar signs began, the temperature drop, the pupil dilation, the sense of an otherworldly presence, I activated my recording devices and established contact. The results were beyond my wildest expectations. Through the radio receivers, I heard not just Morse code, but complex patterns of electromagnetic activity that resembled language. The laptop's software translated these patterns into strings of numbers and symbols that gradually resolved into something resembling coherent communication. The entity wasn't malevolent. It was simply lost. It had been pulled from its native dimension during Marcus's final transmission, trapped in the electromagnetic echo of his desperate call for help. For decades, it had been trying to find a way back, using the anniversary of its displacement as a recurring opportunity to reach out. It needed help, not a host. Working through the night, I managed to establish a crude but effective communication protocol. The entity provided coordinates, not geographical ones, but electromagnetic frequencies that corresponded to specific points in space-time. It needed someone to transmit a signal at precisely the right frequency and the right time, creating a bridge that would allow it to return to its own dimension. The knowledge came with a price. With each night of communication, I felt my own consciousness becoming more attuned to the entity's presence. My pupils began showing signs of the same amber reflection that marked Marcus's episodes. The boundary between my thoughts and its needs grew increasingly thin. But I also felt Marcus changing. As the entity's attention shifted from him to me, his episodes became less severe. His daytime awareness improved, and he began showing signs of genuine recovery. The psychological trauma that had defined his existence for decades was finally beginning to heal. The final transmission was scheduled for December 15th, at precisely 3:33 a.m. I'd calculated the optimal frequency, assembled the necessary equipment, and prepared for what I hoped would be the entity's final journey home. What I hadn't prepared for was the cost of success. As the transmission began, I felt the entity's presence surge through my consciousness like a tide. For a moment, I saw through its perspective, glimpsed the vast, dark spaces between dimensions where it had been lost for so long. I experienced its desperate loneliness, its gratitude for my help, and its promise that Marcus would finally be free. The transmission lasted exactly 7 minutes. When it ended, the oppressive atmosphere that had defined the hospital's night shift was gone. The building felt normal again. Just another psychiatric facility with its usual complement of human troubles. Marcus woke up the next morning with clear eyes and the first genuine smile he'd worn in decades. His recovery was so dramatic that Dr. Reeves called it miraculous, a testament to the power of proper treatment and the human spirit's resilience. I should have felt victorious. I'd helped both Marcus and the entity find their way to freedom. But freedom, I discovered, was a relative concept. The entity had kept its promise. Marcus was no longer its conduit. But the connection we'd established during those weeks of communication had created a permanent link between my consciousness and the spaces between dimensions. I could feel other presences now, other lost things seeking a way home. My pupils had begun showing that telltale amber reflection, and I found myself waking at 3:33 a.m. with an overwhelming urge to help the lost find their way back to where they belonged. The gift of sight came with responsibilities I was only beginning to understand. As I write this, 6 months later, I'm no longer certain whether I freed Marcus or simply took his place. The line between helper and host has blurred beyond recognition. But every night at 3:33 a.m., when the barriers between worlds grow thin, I sit by my radio and listen for the signals of the lost. Sometimes, in the amber light reflected in my bathroom mirror, I catch glimpses of gratitude from those I've helped return home. Other times, I wonder if I'm simply the latest in a long line of willing conduits, each believing they're in control until the moment they realize the truth. The gate, it seems, requires a guardian, and I'm no longer sure if I'm protecting the world from what lies beyond, or protecting what lies beyond from the world. But Marcus sleeps peacefully now, and that has to count for something, even if I'm not sure I'll ever sleep peacefully again. Story 3. The desert swallowed my headlights whole, leaving nothing but the endless black ribbon of Interstate 40 stretching toward Albuquerque. 3 a.m. in the New Mexico wasteland, and I was running on my 4th cup of truck stop coffee, and the kind of exhaustion that makes your eyelids feel like sandpaper. The CB radio crackled with static and distant voices, other drivers fighting the same battle against sleep and solitude. I'd been hauling freight for 15 years, knew every mile of this route like the lines on my weathered hands. But tonight felt different. Wrong. The air itself seemed to press against the cab windows, thick with an expectation I couldn't name. Even the familiar hum of the diesel engine sounded muffled, distant, as if the truck were moving through something denser than air. The first time I saw it in the rearview mirror, I blamed the caffeine jitters. A pale shape flickered at the edge of my vision. There, then gone, like heat lightning on a summer night. I adjusted the mirror, squinted through the red glow of my taillights, saw nothing but empty asphalt receding into darkness. The trailer behind me was empty, heading back to Phoenix after dropping a load in Flagstaff, and the whole rig felt light, almost floating on the smooth highway. But then it appeared again. The creature emerged from the darkness like something born from the desert itself, its coat so white it seemed to glow with its own internal light. An albino deer, massive and perfectly formed, but moving wrong, too fluid, too fast. It kept pace with my truck effortlessly, running at what had to be over 60 miles per hour, but its hooves never touched the ground. The thing glided over the asphalt like a ghost, silent as moonlight. I pressed harder on the accelerator, watching the speedometer climb past 70, then 80. The deer matched my speed without apparent effort, maintaining its position maybe 30 feet behind the trailer. Its eyes, Christ, its eyes, were the color of old bone, empty and knowing at the same time. They never blinked, never looked away from the back of my truck. The rational part of my brain offered explanations. Hallucination brought on by exhaustion, maybe carbon monoxide seeping into the cab, or some kind of optical illusion created by the interplay of headlights and heat shimmer. But the deer's presence felt solid, undeniable, like a weight pressing against my consciousness. I tried focusing on the road ahead, on the familiar rhythm of driving, but my eyes kept drifting to the mirror. Each time I looked, the creature had moved closer. Not running closer, simply existing closer, as if distance were a suggestion it chose to ignore. When I forced myself to stare straight ahead for a full minute, then checked again, the deer was close enough that I could see the individual hairs of its coat, the slight cant of its head as it studied my truck with alien intelligence. The radio crackled. "Eastbound big truck, you got a situation back there?" I grabbed the handset, my voice coming out rougher than intended. "Come again?" "You got some kind of, I don't know what to call it, something following you, white as snow, moving like nothing I ever seen." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Someone else could see it. That should have been reassuring, but instead it made everything worse. If another driver could see the deer, then it was real. And if it was real, then what the hell was it? "You see it too?" I asked. Static filled the silence before the other driver responded. "Brother, I seen a lot of strange things on this highway over the years, but that ain't natural. You might want to consider pulling over, letting it pass." But I couldn't pull over. Some instinct deeper than logic told me that stopping would be a mistake, that the deer wanted me to stop, expected me to stop. So I kept driving, kept the speedometer steady at 85, and tried not to think about the way the creature's gaze felt like ice water trickling down my spine. The miles crawled by in a haze of mounting tension. My muscles ached from gripping the wheel. My jaw hurt from clenching my teeth. The coffee had turned to acid in my stomach, and every nerve in my body screamed at me to do something, anything, to escape the thing that followed without sound or reason. Somewhere around mile marker 216, I made the mistake of looking directly at it. The deer's head turned toward my reflection in the mirror, and for a moment that stretched like taffy, we stared at each other across the impossible distance. Its eyes held the weight of centuries, the patience of stone, and something else, a hunger that had nothing to do with food or flesh. It wanted something from me, or through me, and the need radiated from it like heat from a forge. Then it moved, not forward, not backward, but up, rising from the asphalt like smoke, floating toward the back of my trailer. I watched in sick fascination as it drifted closer, defying every law of physics I understood. The deer's snout touched the chrome bumper with delicate precision, and even through the thick walls of the cab, I swear I could hear it. A sound like wind through dry grass, like whispers in a language I didn't recognize. The truck shuddered, not from any mechanical fault, but as if the very air around it had grown dense. The steering wheel felt sluggish in my hands, and the engine note changed subtly, taking on a deeper, more resonant tone. Whatever this thing was, it was affecting my truck, changing it, leaving its mark on the metal and machinery that carried me through the night. I stomped on the gas pedal, pushing the big rig to its limits. The speedometer hit 90, then 95, the engine roaring in protest. But speed meant nothing to the deer. It remained connected to my bumper, its pale form now seeming to merge with the truck itself, becoming part of the vehicle's shadow. The next exit sign appeared in my headlights. Tucumcari, 5 miles. I'd stopped at the truck stop there dozens of times, knew the layout, the people who worked the night shift. Real people, real conversations, real fluorescent lights that would banish the darkness and whatever rode within it. But as I took the exit ramp, slowing for the first time in 2 hours, the deer simply vanished. One moment it was there, the next, gone, as if it had never existed at all. The sudden absence left me dizzy, disoriented, like waking from a dream I couldn't quite remember. The Flying J truck stop sat like an island of harsh light in the desert darkness. I pulled into the parking area, killed the engine, and sat for a long moment in the sudden silence. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle, and I realized I was afraid to leave the cab, afraid to walk around my truck and see what, if anything, remained of the encounter. The night air felt different when I finally stepped outside, charged with electricity that made my skin crawl. I walked slowly toward the back of the trailer, each step requiring conscious effort. The asphalt beneath my boots felt solid enough, real enough, but the world around me seemed somehow thin, as if I were walking through the surface of still water. The trailer's rear bumper gleamed in the parking lot lights, chrome reflecting the familiar glow of the truck stop. No marks, no scratches, no sign that anything had touched it. But as I bent closer, something caught my eye. A symbol etched into the metal with surgical precision, so fine it was almost invisible. The mark was small, no bigger than a silver dollar, but intricate beyond description. Spirals and angles intertwined in patterns that hurt to look at directly, forming shapes that seemed to shift and change as my eyes tried to follow them. It wasn't scratched or burned into the chrome. It was part of the metal itself, as if the symbol had always been there, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I'd seen similar markings before, in museums and books about southwestern archaeology. Petroglyphs, ancient symbols carved into stone by people who had lived in this desert long before highways and truck stops existed. But this was different, alive somehow, pulsing with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. Inside the truck stop, the fluorescent lights buzzed with unusual intensity, casting everything in sharp relief. The night clerk, a Navajo woman named Sarah, who'd been working here for as long as I'd been driving this route, looked up from her magazine with an expression I'd never seen before. Concern mixed with something deeper, more primal. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, her voice carefully neutral. I wanted to tell her about the deer, about the symbol, about the way my truck had felt different during those 2 hours of impossible pursuit. Instead, I bought a cup of coffee and a pack of gum, making small talk about the weather and road conditions. But Sarah's eyes never left my face, and when I finally worked up the courage to mention the petroglyphic symbol, her expression changed completely. "You need to be careful," she said quietly, glancing around the empty store. "Some things in this desert don't like being disturbed." "What kind of things?" She hesitated, then leaned closer across the counter. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the guardians, spirits that protected sacred places from outsiders. They could take many forms, but always appeared as creatures that didn't quite belong in this world. White animals especially. Animals that moved without sound, without leaving tracks." "Just stories," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Maybe. But my grandmother also said that seeing one was a warning, that it meant you'd crossed into territory you weren't supposed to enter, or that you'd carried something sacred away from where it belonged." I thought about my route. about the long stretch of highway that cut through reservation land, past ancient ruins and burial sites. Had I somehow trespassed? Violated some invisible boundary? What happens if you ignore the warning? I asked. Sarah's expression grew grave. They follow you. Not just for a night or a week, but until you understand what you've done wrong. And if you still don't listen? She shook her head. The spirits have their own ways of teaching respect. I left the truck stop with more questions than answers, but I had a delivery to make in Albuquerque. The symbol on my bumper seemed to pulse with dim light as I performed my pre-trip inspection, but in the harsh glare of the parking lot, I could almost convince myself it was just a trick of the chrome's reflection. The remainder of the drive passed without incident. No pale deer, no otherworldly encounters, just the familiar rhythm of road and engine. But something had changed in me, or perhaps in the world around me. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds carried farther, and I found myself noticing details I'd never paid attention to before. The way shadows fell across the highway, the patterns made by telephone poles against the sky, the subtle variations in the desert's endless expanse. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into research. I spent hours in libraries and online, studying Navajo mythology and southwestern archaeology. The symbol on my bumper, I learned, was related to protective spirits called Yebi Chai, holy people who served as intermediaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. But more disturbing was what I discovered about territorial guardians, entities that protected sacred sites from desecration. According to the sources I found, these guardians could appear as white animals, bears, wolves, deer, that moved without natural sound or movement. They were said to test travelers, to determine whether they came in peace or with intent to harm. Those who passed the test were left alone. Those who failed. The accounts were vague about consequences, but all mentioned the same thing. The guardian would follow the transgressor until balance was restored. Some stories spoke of madness, others of mysterious disappearances. But the most unsettling accounts described a gradual transformation, a blending of the spiritual and physical worlds that left the affected person forever changed. I began to notice the changes in myself around the third week. Subtle at first, an increased sensitivity to light and sound, a growing unease in crowded places, a persistent feeling that I was being watched. But as days passed, the sensations intensified. I could hear conversations from impossible distances, see details in darkness that should have been invisible, sense the presence of others long before they came into view. My truck felt different too. The engine ran smoother, responded more quickly to my commands. Other drivers began commenting on it, asking what modifications I'd made. But I hadn't changed anything, except for the symbol on the bumper, which seemed to grow more complex each time I looked at it, revealing new layers of meaning and pattern. The dream started a month after the encounter, always the same. I'm driving through the desert at night, and in the rearview mirror, I see not just the white deer, but dozens of them. An entire herd of silent guardians following in perfect formation. They're not chasing me, they're escorting me, guiding me towards something I can't see but know I must find. I wake from these dreams with the taste of sage in my mouth and the sound of distant drums echoing in my ears. Sometimes I find myself standing in my apartment's parking lot, fully dressed, with no memory of how I got there. Other times I discover maps spread across my kitchen table marked with routes I don't remember planning, destinations I've never heard of. The rational part of my mind insists that stress and isolation are taking their toll, that the encounter with the deer was nothing more than a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But the symbol on my bumper continues to evolve, and I can feel something changing in the world around me, as if invisible barriers are slowly dissolving. Last week, I made a decision that may have been foolish or inevitable. I booked a run that would take me back through the same stretch of New Mexico desert where I first saw the deer. Not because I want to see it again, but because I need to understand what happened, what's happening, and what comes next. The preparation felt ritualistic. I cleaned my truck inside and out, performed every maintenance check twice, and loaded supplies for a longer journey than the manifest indicated. Sarah from the truck stop called me. I'd never given her my number, didn't even know she had it. to warn me about driving alone through the desert at night. "It's not safe," she said, her voice tight with concern. "Not for you. Not anymore. But I'm going anyway. Tonight, in fact. The desert is calling, and I can feel the guardians waiting, patient as stone, ready to complete whatever transaction we began that night 3 months ago. I don't know what I'll find out there in the darkness. Maybe nothing. Just empty highway and the familiar loneliness of the long haul. Maybe the deer will return, and this time I'll have the courage to follow where it leads. Or maybe I'll discover that the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds is more permeable than I ever imagined, and that some crossings can never be undone. The symbol on my bumper pulses with soft light as I write this, and I can hear something calling from the direction of the interstate. Not a voice, exactly, but a presence that speaks directly to something deep in my chest. It's time to go. Time to complete the journey I started the night I met the Guardian without feet. Whatever happens out there in the desert, I suspect I won't be the same person who returns. But maybe that's what the Guardians intended all along. Not to punish or destroy, but to transform, to bridge the gap between worlds that have been separate for too long. The engine is idling in the parking lot, and the night is waiting. Some paths, once started, can only be followed to their end. Story 4. The notification sound cuts through the 2:47 a.m. silence like a blade through skin. My phone's screen glows against the darkness of my dorm room, casting harsh shadows on the walls that seem to shift and writhe in my peripheral vision. The message is from Marcus, our channel's editor, and it contains a single word that makes my blood run cold. Watch. 3 hours ago, I was convinced we'd captured nothing more than an abandoned playground and some decent atmospheric footage for our urban exploration channel, Forgotten Spaces. Now, staring at the attached video file, I realize we may have documented something far more disturbing than we ever intended. The timestamp shows 11:23 p.m. from yesterday's live stream. In the frame, I can see myself standing near the rusted swing set, my voice muffled by the phone's speaker as I described the eerie stillness of the place. But there, in the background bleachers, structures I remember being completely empty, dark figures sit motionless, their faces obscured by what appear to be rough canvas masks. The image quality is poor, like it's been compressed and recompressed, but their presence is unmistakable. I scroll through my camera roll frantically, pulling up the original footage we'd saved locally. The bleachers are empty, completely, undeniably empty. My hands shake as I call Marcus. He answers on the first ring, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and something else. Fear, maybe, or disbelief. "Tell me you see them too," he whispers. I see them. The words feel thick in my throat. But they weren't there when we filmed it. I know. I've been going through every frame of the original. Nothing. But these edited clips. He pauses and I can hear him swallow hard. They're not just from one angle. I've got footage from cameras we never set up, positions we never filmed from. And the timestamp data, it's all from our stream, but the metadata shows editing dates from 3 months ago. 3 months ago, we hadn't even heard of this playground. I end the call and pace my narrow dorm room, bare feet silent on the cold linoleum. The memory of yesterday plays in my mind like a film reel I can't stop. The 4 of us loading camera equipment into Jake's beaten Toyota, the drive through South Carolina's rural highways, the discovery of the playground nestled in a clearing, where the trees formed an almost perfect circle around the rusted equipment. The place had felt wrong from the moment we'd arrived. Not just abandoned. Abandoned places were our specialty. This felt watched. The rubber matting beneath the playground equipment had cracked and split, forming a perfect circle of dead earth where nothing grew. Not a single blade of grass, not even weeds. Just packed dirt the color of dried blood. But we'd been filming for 17 minutes without incident. The live stream had been going smoothly, with our usual modest audience of horror enthusiasts dropping comments about the creepy atmosphere. I'd been talking about the playground's history, how it had been built in the 1970s as part of a small community center that had closed after budget cuts. When we'd decided to wrap up and head back to the car, that's when I'd noticed the seesaw. Even now, the memory makes my skin crawl. The thing had been moving in a steady, rhythmic pattern, like someone was sitting on the opposite end. But the seat was empty, and there wasn't so much as a breeze to disturb the humid South Carolina air. Up and down, with the soft squeak of old metal that seemed to echo longer than it should have. "Just old equipment settling," Jake had said, but his voice had carried an uncertainty that mirrored my own growing unease. We'd packed up quickly after that, eager to get back to campus and review the footage. The drive back had been quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I'd felt like we were being followed, though every time I'd checked the mirrors, the dark highway behind us had been empty. Now, at nearly 3 a.m., I'm staring at video evidence of something that shouldn't exist. My phone buzzes again. This time it's a group text from Danny, our audio engineer. His message contains a single attachment, a spectrogram analysis of the playground footage. Even with my limited technical knowledge, I can see the problem immediately. There are voice patterns embedded in the background noise, frequencies that register as human speech, but played at speeds and pitches that would be impossible for the human ear to detect in real time. The blood in my veins turns to ice water as I read Danny's accompanying message. The voices are saying names. Our names. I download the audio file he's isolated and slow it down, adjusting the pitch until the distorted sounds begin to resolve into something recognizable. The whispers are barely audible, layered beneath the ambient noise of our recording, but they're there. Marcus, Jake, Danny, David. My name, spoken in a voice that doesn't belong to any of us, repeated over and over like a mantra. The timestamp shows these voices were present throughout the entire 17-minute recording, but we'd heard nothing at the time. The room feels smaller now, the walls pressing closer. I check the locks on my door twice, then move to the window. My dorm is on the 3rd floor overlooking the quad, but I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me from the darkness outside. My laptop chimes with a notification from YouTube Studio. Our channel has a new video scheduled for auto-publish at 3:06 a.m., just 19 minutes from now. The thumbnail shows the playground, but the image is wrong. The angle is too high, like it was taken from the bleachers themselves, looking down at the empty equipment. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, is the edge of what might be a canvas mask. I didn't upload this video. None of us did. My fingers fly across the keyboard as I try to access the video's settings, but I'm met with an error message. Content restricted by channel administrator. But I am the channel administrator, the only administrator. The video's title makes my stomach lurch. The Watchers. Raw footage. 3:06. And I call Marcus again, but the line goes straight to voicemail. The same with Jake and Danny. Either they're all asleep, or something else is happening, something I don't want to consider. The upload progress bar shows 97% complete. I try everything I can think of, changing the channel password, deleting the video, even attempting to suspend the entire channel. Nothing works. The system responds as if I'm not authorized to make changes, though the dashboard still shows my name as the owner. With 5 minutes until the scheduled publish time, I'm running out of options. The video's description, which I definitely didn't write, contains a single line. They've been waiting. Now they'll have their audience. I close my laptop and grab my phone, scrolling through my contacts for YouTube's emergency support line. The number rings endlessly before connecting me to an automated system that seems to cycle through the same menu options no matter what I select. 3 minutes. The temperature in my room has dropped noticeably. My breath forms small clouds in the air, and the moisture on my windows has begun to frost over despite the fact that it's July in North Carolina. The silence outside is absolute. No insects, no distant traffic, nothing but the soft hum of my laptop's cooling fan. 2 minutes. I can feel them now, the Watchers. Not seeing them, but feeling their presence like a weight against my skin. They're not in the room with me, but they're close. Waiting. The canvas masks from the footage flash in my mind, and I imagine dozens of them sitting in those empty bleachers, patient and still, watching through screens that shouldn't exist. 1 minute. My phone shows 3:05 a.m. I'm refreshing our channel page obsessively, watching the subscriber count. We'd had 2,847 subscribers when I'd last checked an hour ago. The number now reads 2,847,000, an impossible jump that the platform should never allow. The comments section is already active, filled with messages from accounts I don't recognize. Users with names like BlackerWatcher4 and CanvasFace1973 are posting identical messages. "We see you, David. We've always been watching. My name." They know my name. 3:06 a.m. The video goes live. I watch the view count climb impossibly fast. Thousands of views in the first minute, then tens of thousands. The comments scroll by too quickly to read, but I catch fragments. Finally. Been waiting. Come back to the playground. The footage is different from what we'd actually recorded. The camera angles shift and move as if operated by someone else. Someone who was there with us but invisible. The playground equipment casts shadows that don't match the sun's position, and in the background, barely visible, those figures in canvas masks sit and watch our every move. But the most disturbing part is the ending. The video doesn't cut off when we left the playground. It continues, showing the empty space after our departure, the seesaw still moving in its rhythmic pattern. The camera slowly pans to the bleachers, and for just a moment, the figures become clear. They're not wearing masks. The canvas-like texture is their skin, stretched and pale, with dark holes where eyes should be. And they're all looking directly at the camera, directly at me, watching through the screen. The video ends with a single frame of text. Next live stream. Tomorrow, 3:06 a.m. You know where to find us. I slam my laptop shut, but the damage is done. The video has been published, seen by thousands of impossible viewers who shouldn't exist. My phone buzzes with notifications, messages from numbers I don't recognize, all variations of the same thing. We're coming. I check the channel analytics, and the data makes no sense. The geographic distribution shows views from locations that don't exist, coordinates that plot to empty spaces on maps or places that were abandoned decades ago. The watch time suggests some viewers have been watching for hours, despite the video being only 18 minutes long. The room is freezing now, and I can see my breath clearly. Outside my window, the campus quad is empty, but the streetlights are flickering in a pattern that seems almost rhythmic, like the seesaw, like a heartbeat. I try to convince myself this is an elaborate prank, maybe some kind of ARG that's gotten out of hand. But deep down, I know better. We found something at that playground, or something found us. The watchers in the canvas masks, or whatever they really are, have been waiting, patient and still, for someone to give them a window into our world. And now they have it. My phone shows another notification from YouTube Studio. A new video has been scheduled for tomorrow at 3:06 a.m. The thumbnail shows my dorm room, taken from an angle that should be impossible, from outside my third-floor window. I'm not going to sleep tonight. Maybe not ever again. Because I know now what the watchers really want. They don't just want to observe. They want to interact. They want to step through the screen and into our reality, one viewer at a time. And I've given them exactly what they need. An audience. The notification sound chimes again, and this time it's a live stream alert from our channel. The title reads, David's Room, Live Now. The view count is already climbing, and the comments are flowing in from accounts that shouldn't exist, watchers who've been waiting in empty bleachers for decades. I look at my laptop, still closed, and then at my phone, which shows the stream is coming from a source I can't identify. But I know where it's coming from. I can feel their presence, stronger now, pressing against the boundaries of what's real. The watchers aren't just watching anymore, they're broadcasting, and I'm the next show. Story 5. The leather-bound journal crackled like autumn leaves as I opened it for the 100th time, the musty scent of decades-old paper filling my nostrils. My great-grandfather's spidery handwriting sprawled across yellowed pages, each word a breadcrumb leading deeper into something I wasn't sure I wanted to follow. October 13th, 1923. The gentleman appeared in Farmer Henderson's barn at the stroke of midnight, dressed in a fine black tailcoat that seemed to absorb what little moonlight filtered through the rotting boards. His face was that of a learned man, perhaps a professor or banker, but when he stepped forward, the hay rustled beneath cloven hooves. The sound still echoes in my dreams. I'd inherited this journal 3 months ago when my grandmother passed, along with her rambling stories about great-grandfather Edmund's dark period after his return from Dakota. The family had always dismissed his tales as the ravings of a man broken by prairie isolation, but something about the meticulous detail, the consistent internal logic of his entries, gnawed at me. The hypnotherapy session had been a desperate attempt to understand what Edmund had truly experienced. Dr. Marianne Kellner specialized in past life regression and family trauma therapy, though she'd raised an eyebrow when I'd explained my unusual request. Ancestral memory, she'd called it, the possibility that traumatic experiences could somehow imprint themselves on descendants through genetic or psychological channels. Her office had been sterile, professional, beige walls, soft lighting, the gentle hum of a white noise machine. I'd settled into the leather recliner, closed my eyes, and let her voice guide me backward through time, through my own memories, and then somehow beyond them. Now imagine you're drifting further back, before your birth, before your parents' birth. Let yourself connect with your family's history, with Edmund's experience. What happened next defied every rational explanation I'd spent my academic career constructing. The vision came in fragments, like watching a film through smoke. I was standing in a vast field under a star-choked sky, but the stars were wrong. Too bright, too close, arranged in patterns that hurt to contemplate. The air tasted of copper and ozone, and somewhere in the distance, a sound like massive machinery grinding against itself filled the night. Then I saw them, 3 silver discs hovering perhaps 50 feet above the wheat, their surfaces reflecting nothing despite the abundance of starlight. They moved with predatory grace, scanning the ground with beams of light that seemed to penetrate not just the earth, but something deeper, something that existed in the spaces between spaces. The pressure in my skull intensified, a drilling sensation that made my teeth ache. The grinding sound grew louder, and I realized it wasn't machinery at all. It was something trying to communicate, to force meaning through the inadequate channels of human perception. I jolted awake in Dr. Kellner's office, my shirt soaked with sweat, her concerned face swimming into focus. The session had lasted 3 hours, though I'd only been under for what felt like minutes. But it was when I returned home that the real horror began. My study, usually a sanctuary of organized chaos with books stacked in familiar towers and papers arranged in my own peculiar system, had been transformed. Burned into the hardwood floor were symbols I'd never seen before. Sinuous lines that seemed to writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. Geometric patterns that suggested depth and dimension that shouldn't exist in two-dimensional space. The marks were precise, as if carved with a branding iron heated to exact temperatures. The wood around each symbol was charred but not destroyed, creating perfect black impressions that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. I'd called Dr. Kellner immediately, but she'd had no explanation. Spontaneous psychokinetic episodes were rare but documented, she'd said, usually triggered by intense emotional states. The mind, when pushed to its limits, could sometimes manifest physical phenomena, but even she'd sounded uncertain. That was 6 weeks ago. Since then, new symbols had appeared every few days, always after periods of intense research or when I'd been examining Edmund's journal. They'd spread across my study floor like an infection, each new mark connecting to the existing pattern in ways that seemed almost mathematical in their precision. The journal offered tantalizing clues. Edmund had encountered his gentleman multiple times, always in the same barn, always accompanied by the same otherworldly phenomena. But as I read deeper, I began to notice something that chilled me more than any supernatural encounter. The symbols he'd sketched in the margins were identical to those appearing in my study. October 20th, 1923. He showed me the marks again, burnt into the barn wall. Says they're part of something larger, a pattern that's been building for centuries. Warned me that completion would mean the end of barriers, the collapse of the walls between what is and what should never be. I pray I have the strength to resist. October 27th, 1923. The marks are in my house now. Martha found them in the cellar, burned into the stone itself. She's taken the children to her sisters. I don't blame her. The pattern is 2/3 complete. November 3rd, 1923. I understand now. The gentleman isn't the cause. He's the warning. Something else is coming. Something that exists in the spaces between stars, between thoughts, between heartbeats. The lights in the sky aren't visitors. They're scouts, preparing the way. November 10th, 1923. Last entry. The pattern is nearly complete. I can feel it pulling at my mind, demanding that I add the final marks. But I won't. I'll hide this journal and pray that knowledge dies with me. The barn burns tonight. But Edmund had been wrong about knowledge dying with him. The pattern hadn't stopped. It had merely waited, dormant, until someone with the right combination of obsession and vulnerability came along. I'd started experiencing the visions even without hypnosis now. They came during the day, superimposed over normal reality like double-exposed photographs. I'd be reading in my study when suddenly the walls would become transparent, revealing vast mechanisms churning in spaces that didn't exist. The grinding sound would fill my ears, and I'd feel that same drilling pressure in my skull. The symbols on my floor now covered nearly 3/4 of the available space, their arrangement forming a complex mandala that seemed to shift and breathe when observed peripherally. Sometimes I'd catch myself tracing their lines with my finger, feeling their grooves pulse with warmth despite the cold, charred wood. My sleep had become a minefield of half-dreams where I stood in that endless field, watching the silver discs circle overhead like patient vultures. The gentleman from Edmund's journal had begun appearing too, always at the edge of my vision, his refined features and professional bearing made grotesque by the cloven hooves that clicked against invisible floors. He never spoke, but I could feel his presence like a weight against my consciousness. He was trying to tell me something, or perhaps warning me of something. The distinction had become irrelevant. The most disturbing development was my growing compulsion to complete the pattern. I'd find myself standing in my study at odd hours, staring at the burned symbols, my mind automatically filling in the missing connections. I could see how they fit together, how the incomplete spaces yearned to be filled. The logic was beautiful in its alien precision. Edmund's journal had become my lifeline, the only thing anchoring me to the possibility that resistance was possible. His final entries detailed his struggle against the same compulsion, his desperate attempts to destroy the partial pattern before it could reach completion. The gentleman explained that the pattern exists outside of time, that each generation of my family would be called to continue the work. He said it with such sadness, as if he genuinely regretted the necessity. But necessity for what? What lies beyond the completion of these marks? I'd started researching the history of the barn Edmund had described, using my academic connections to access property records and historical surveys. The land had a strange history. Multiple families over the centuries had abandoned their homesteads there, always suddenly, always leaving behind reports of strange phenomena. The current owner, a corporate farming conglomerate, had built a modern facility on the site, but their construction reports mentioned anomalous materials found in the foundation of the old barn, materials that had been sent to government laboratories and never returned. 3 days ago, I'd driven to Dakota, despite every rational instinct screaming against it. The new facility was a sterile monument to industrial agriculture, but something about the location felt familiar in a way that bypassed conscious recognition. The earth itself seemed to hum with barely contained energy. That night in my motel room, I dreamed of the silver discs again. But this time, I was inside one of them, standing in a chamber that existed in too many dimensions, surrounded by entities that might have been machines, or might have been something else entirely. They communicated through that same grinding sound, and somehow I understood their message. The pattern was never about summoning or barriers. It was about completion, about finishing something that had been started long before humans walked the earth. The gentleman had been their herald, their attempt to communicate with minds too limited to comprehend their true nature. I'd awakened with new symbols burned into my motel room floor. Back home now, I stand in my study, surrounded by nearly complete pattern. Only a few marks remain, their absence creating a tension that makes my bones ache. I can feel the weight of generations pressing against my consciousness, the accumulated need of something vast and patient that exists in the spaces between seconds. The journal trembles in my hands as I read Edmund's final words. I pray that knowledge dies with me, but knowledge doesn't die. It waits, it grows, it finds new carriers, and I can feel myself reaching the same crossroads Edmund faced. The choice between completion and resistance, between knowledge and willful ignorance. The silver discs are visible through my window now, hanging motionless in the afternoon sky. No one else seems to notice them, but I can feel their attention like the weight of distant stars. They're waiting, patient as geological time, for me to make the same choice every generation of my family has faced. My hand moves toward the floor, toward the empty spaces in the pattern, and I realize that the choice may not be mine at all. The symbols seem to complete themselves, my finger tracing their final lines as if guided by something beyond conscious will. The pattern is finished. The grinding sound fills the world, and reality tears like old paper. Through the gaps, I see truth that makes madness seem like mercy. We were never alone, never the dominant species, never anything more than gardeners tending a crop we couldn't recognize. The gentleman stands in my doorway, his refined features touched with something that might be compassion. He tips his hat and speaks for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. Welcome to the harvest, Edmund's boy. Your family's work is finally complete. And as the walls dissolve and the silver discs descend through spaces that exist between dimensions, I understand that I'm either witnessing the end of human ignorance or the final manifestation of inherited madness. The distinction no longer matters. The pattern is complete, and everything that follows is consequence. Story 6. The first time I woke up with the marks, I blamed the mattress. 3 perfect semicircles pressed into my chest, each the size of a quarter, purple-black against my pale skin. The bruises ached with a deep, hollow pain that seemed to reach through my ribs and squeeze something vital inside me. I'd been sleeping on my side, always on my side, the way I'd done since childhood. The loft's hardwood floors stretched endlessly around my bed, a converted warehouse space in Chicago's River North that I'd chosen for its openness, its light. Now, in the gray dawn filtering through industrial windows, that openness felt like exposure. 3 weeks passed before I heard it the first time, a slow, deliberate creak advancing across the floor. Not the random settling of old wood, but something measured, purposeful. Step by step, it approached my bed with the patience of a predator. The sound always came when I was drifting, caught in that liminal space between consciousness and sleep. My body would tense, every muscle coiled and ready, but the paralysis of near sleep held me prisoner. I could only lie there, listening to the methodical approach, feeling the floorboards vibrate with each footfall. Then the pressure would settle on my chest like a massive, invisible hand. The weight wasn't crushing, but it was wrong. Too cold, too empty, as if something were drawing warmth and substance from my body rather than adding weight to it. I'd struggled to breathe, my chest rising and falling against the inexorable force, until finally the thing would lift and I'd gasp awake. Always the marks, always the semicircles. Dr. Martinez prescribed sleeping pills, then anxiety medication, then suggested I find a therapist. She examined the bruises with clinical detachment, her fingers tracing the curved edges. Pressure marks, she said, but I've never seen anything quite like this pattern. I didn't tell her about the sound, didn't mention the weight. The rational part of my mind knew how it would sound. The lonely man in the empty loft, cracking under the isolation of city life. Chicago pressed against my windows, 8 million people living their lives mere feet away, yet I might as well have been on the moon. The thermal camera was my first purchase, a professional-grade FLIR unit that had cost me $3,000 and most of my savings. I positioned it to capture the entire sleeping area, its lens trained on the space beside my bed where I imagined the present stood. Next came the pressure sensors. 4 industrial-grade plates I slid under the mattress at strategic points. They'd detect the slightest change in weight distribution, feeding data to my laptop in real time. The EEG headband was the final piece, a consumer-grade device that monitored brain waves and sleep stages. I was going to prove my sanity with science. The first night with the equipment, I lay rigid in bed, more awake than I'd been in weeks. The camera's infrared display cast a green glow across the room, and I could see my own heat signature blazing white-hot against the cool darkness. Hours passed before exhaustion finally claimed me. I woke to familiar pressure, familiar pain. But this time, I had evidence. The thermal footage showed nothing. My body glowed steady white throughout the night, the surrounding space a consistent cool blue. No movement, no anomalies, no sign of any presence. The pressure sensors recorded only the constant weight of my own body, with no variations or spikes. But the temperature readings told a different story. At precisely 2:47 a.m., according to the timestamp, a zone of intense cold had materialized directly beside my bed. The camera's sensors registered 10°F in a roughly circular area, as if someone had opened a door to the Arctic. The cold zone had appeared suddenly, lingered for exactly 4 minutes, then vanished. I checked the EEG data. At 2:46 a.m., my brainwaves had entered REM sleep. 60 seconds later, the cold had arrived. Sleep became a war zone. I fought it with caffeine, with bright lights, with the nervous energy of increasing paranoia. The loft's exposed brick walls seemed to close in despite the space, and the industrial pipes running across the ceiling cast shadows that moved when I wasn't looking directly at them. I started sleeping in shifts, 2 hours maximum before forcing myself awake. The marks appeared regardless, sometimes after 90 minutes, sometimes after 20. My body began to revolt against the treatment, muscles aching, hands trembling, thoughts becoming increasingly scattered. The cold zone appeared every time I reached REM sleep. Always the same temperature, always the same duration, always 60 seconds after the brain activity changed. I filled notebooks with measurements, charts, desperate attempts to find a pattern beyond the obvious. On the 7th night of my vigil, I noticed something new on the thermal display. The cold zone wasn't just cold, it was moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it was growing larger. What had started as a circle perhaps 3 feet in diameter now stretched nearly 5 feet across. I called in sick to work. Then I stopped answering my phone entirely. The world beyond my loft felt increasingly distant, muffled, as if I were underwater. Only the nightly ritual mattered now. The preparation, the measurements, the desperate fight against sleep. The pressure grew stronger. What had once been uncomfortable became genuinely painful, the invisible weight bearing down with increasing force. The semicircular marks deepened, taking on a bluish tint that reminded me of frostbite. Sometimes I could see my breath in the moments before waking, tiny puffs of vapor in the supposedly empty air. I started to question the equipment. Maybe the thermal camera was malfunctioning. Maybe the EEG headband was faulty. I bought backup units, different brands, but they all told the same story. The cold was real, measurable, consistent. But what could create such intense cold without any visible source? No machinery, no chemicals, no explanation that fit within the bounds of rational thought. I researched thermodynamics, studied atmospheric physics, even delved into fringe theories about dimensional portals and quantum fields. Nothing fit. The breakthrough came on the 15th night. I'd been dozing fitfully when the familiar sound began. But this time, I was ready. I'd trained myself to respond to the first creak, to force my eyes open before the paralysis could take hold. The thermal camera showed the cold zone forming beside my bed, but I was watching it happen in real time. The temperature dropped so quickly that moisture in the air began to condense. tiny droplets forming and falling like supernatural rain. The display showed the zone's edges clearly now, a perfect circle of impossible cold. And in that moment, I understood. The cold wasn't coming from something else. It was coming from me. I watched my own heat signature on the monitor, saw the way warmth drained from my body in precise circular patterns. The EEG showed my brain activity shifting, not into normal REM sleep, but into something else entirely. The waves were wrong, too regular, too purposeful. Whatever was happening to me, it wasn't external, it was internal. My body was generating the cold, projecting it outward in a focused beam that somehow manifested as physical pressure. The marks on my chest weren't caused by something pressing down. They were created by something pulling up, drawing heat and life from my flesh. I stopped fighting sleep. What was the point? The enemy wasn't in the room with me. The enemy was me. The cold zone expanded nightly now, creeping outward like a malignant tumor. 6 feet, 8 feet. I watched it grow on the thermal display, this cancer of absolute zero spreading across my loft. The pressure intensified proportionally, the weight on my chest becoming almost unbearable. The marks began to appear in new places. My arms, my legs, my neck. Always the same semicircular pattern, always the same deep purple-black color. I looked like I was being devoured from the outside in, consumed by some invisible force that fed on warmth and life. I researched sleep disorders, rare neurological conditions, anything that might explain what was happening to me. I found nothing. The medical literature had no precedent for spontaneous thermodynamic manipulation during sleep. The physics journals contained no theories about biological heat projection. I was alone with something that shouldn't exist. The final night, though I didn't know it would be the last, I made a decision. I would stay awake completely, fight sleep with every tool at my disposal. Stimulants, bright lights, constant movement. I would break the cycle through sheer force of will. By 3 a.m., I was hallucinating. Shadows moved across the walls in patterns that almost made sense, and the sound of my own heartbeat echoed through the loft like footsteps. My notebooks were filled with increasingly erratic handwriting, measurements that devolved into unintelligible scrawls. But I was awake. The thermal camera showed steady temperatures, no anomalies, no cold zones. The EEG headband registered alert consciousness, no REM activity. I was winning. That's when I noticed the readings from the pressure sensors. They were changing. Slowly, incrementally, but definitely changing. The weight on my bed was increasing, as if something were settling onto the mattress beside me. But the thermal camera showed nothing. The loft was empty, silent, normal. I watched the numbers climb on my laptop screen. 0.5 pounds, 1.2 pounds, 3.7 pounds. The change was so gradual that I might have missed it if not for the constant vigilance of exhaustion-fueled paranoia. At 4:15 a.m., the pressure reached 15 pounds. I could feel the mattress sagging slightly, the springs compressing under invisible weight. The thermal camera registered nothing. The room remained empty. I understood then, in that moment of perfect clarity that comes only through absolute exhaustion, that I had been asking the wrong question. The issue wasn't what was happening to me while I slept. The issue was what was happening to me while I was awake. The cold zones, the pressure, the marks. They weren't products of my sleeping mind. They were products of my waking one. My desperate attempts to measure and quantify the phenomenon had created it. My fear had given it form. My insomnia had given it substance. I was the source. I was the cold. I was the pressure. And now, fully awake and aware, I could feel it growing stronger. The weight on my bed continued to increase. 25 pounds. 40 pounds. The thermal camera showed nothing, but my own body heat was beginning to fade. I watched my glowing white form on the monitor slowly dim to yellow, then orange, then red. The semicircular marks on my chest began to throb in rhythm with my heartbeat. The pattern was expanding, new curves appearing as if drawn by invisible hands. Or perhaps they had always been there. and I was only now aware enough to see them. I reached for my phone to call someone, anyone, but my fingers were too cold to work the touch screen. The loft's heating system was running at full capacity, yet the temperature continued to drop. My breath came in visible puffs, and frost began to form on the windows. The weight beside me shifted, and I felt the mattress dip as something settled more comfortably into position. The presence I had been seeking was finally here, fully manifested, but it had always been here. It was me. I was it. The thermal camera finally registered something new, a perfect human-shaped zone of absolute zero, lying beside me on the bed. The outline was familiar, identical to my own proportions. I was looking at my own heat signature, inverted and reversed, a perfect negative of my living form. As I watched, the cold figure began to turn toward me. The temperature reading dropped below the camera's minimum threshold. The pressure sensors showed the weight shifting, repositioning itself. I knew, with the absolute certainty of the sleep-deprived and the dying, that when the cold figure finished turning, I would be looking at my own face. The marks on my chest gave a final violent throb. I felt something crucial tear loose inside me, some vital connection severed. The heat drained from my body in a rush, and I watched my thermal signature fade to black on the monitor. The last thing I recorded was the sound of my own breathing, doubled and echoing through the loft. Two sets of lungs working in perfect synchronization, one warm and desperate, the other cold and patient. I am still awake. I am still watching. The equipment continues to run, powered by batteries that somehow never drain. The readings continue to record, documenting the impossible. But I am no longer sure which figure on the bed is me. The warm one grows colder each night, while the cold one seems to gain substance and presence. Sometimes I think I am the one watching from the chair, studying the thermal display. Sometimes I think I am the one lying on the bed, feeling the weight of my own presence settling over me like a blanket. The marks continue to appear, and I continue to document them. But now I understand their true nature. They are not wounds or bruises. They are signatures, proof of contact between two states of being that should never touch. I am the observer and the observed, the hunter and the hunted, the heat and the cold. I am the pressure that settles on my own chest, the weight that grows heavier with each passing night. And I am still awake, always awake, watching myself sleep, studying the readings, measuring the impossible. The cold zone continues to expand. Soon it will fill the entire loft. Soon it will spill out into the hallways, down the stairs, onto the streets of Chicago. And perhaps then, finally, I will understand which one of us is real. The equipment hums quietly in the darkness, recording everything, proving nothing. The pressure grows stronger, and I sink deeper into the mattress under the weight of my own presence. I am still here. We are still here. The measurements continue, precise and inexplicable, documenting the slow consumption of heat and life and sanity. And we are still awake, always awake, watching ourselves sleep while something that might be consciousness dreams of being human in a loft in Chicago, surrounded by the endless cold of its own making. Story 7. The divorce papers still smelled like Karen's perfume when I signed them 3 months ago. Now, standing in the doorway of my childhood home, I inhaled the familiar scent of rotting wood and decades-old dust that had replaced everything I'd once called mine. The Victorian house loomed against the October sky like a weathered monument to better times, its gabled roof and wraparound porch sagging under the weight of neglect and my father's 20-year absence. I'd returned to Millbrook, Pennsylvania, with nothing but my guitars, a truck full of debt, and the desperate hope that renovating the attic into a studio might salvage what remained of my music career. The real estate agent had been brutally honest about the house's condition, but sentiment and financial necessity had overruled common sense. Besides, where else could a washed-up session musician afford 3,000 square feet and the kind of soundproofing that thick Victorian walls provided, The attic stretched the full length of the house, its pitched ceiling creating natural acoustics that had drawn me here as a child. I'd spent countless hours in this space, strumming my father's old acoustic while rain drummed against the dormer windows. Now, 35 years later, I was back with my Stratocaster and a Marshall amp, trying to resurrect dreams that had died somewhere between alimony payments and credit card statements. The first week passed in a blur of insulation, drywall, and electrical work. I'd hired local contractors to handle the heavy lifting, but the final touches, the soundproofing foam, the equipment setup, the creation of my sanctuary, those were mine alone. Each evening, after the workers left, I'd climb the narrow stairs to survey my progress. The space was transforming from a cobwebbed storage area into something that might actually inspire music again. It was during the second week that I first noticed the resonance. I'd finished installing the last acoustic panel and decided to test the room's sound. Nothing formal, just a few chords to see how the space handled my guitar's voice. I plugged in my Stratocaster, adjusted the amp's settings, and strummed a simple E minor chord. The sound was clean, warm, with just enough reverb to give it depth without muddying the tone. But as the chord faded, I heard something else. A faint harmonic, hovering just at the edge of perception. It wasn't quite an echo, more like an answer. I played the chord again, listening carefully. There it was, a subtle A note, barely audible, seeming to drift from the far end of the room. I checked my equipment, thinking perhaps a tube was starting to fail, or a connection had come loose. Everything appeared normal. I tried a different chord, this time a G major. Again, as my strings fell silent, that whisper of response. This time what sounded like a D note, perfectly pitched to complement what I'd played. For the next hour, I experimented with different chords and progressions, always listening for that phantom accompaniment. Sometimes it was there, sometimes not. When it did appear, it was always harmonically correct, always musically appropriate, but never quite the note I expected. It was as if the room itself was suggesting improvements to my playing, offering subtle corrections to my musical instincts. I told myself it was the acoustics of the old house, some quirk of the wood and plaster that created these harmonic illusions. Old buildings were full of mysteries, and sound could behave strangely in spaces that had absorbed decades of noise and silence. But even as I rationalized the phenomenon, I found myself staying in the attic later each evening, playing longer sessions, listening for those ghostly responses. The third week brought new developments. I'd started working on a composition, something I hadn't attempted in years. The piece was melancholy, built around a descending chromatic line that seemed to emerge from the very walls of the room. As I played, developing the melody, those phantom harmonics became more pronounced, more confident. They weren't just responding to my music anymore. They were participating in it. I began to notice that certain chord progressions would trigger more elaborate responses. A simple EVI progression might elicit a complex counter melody that weaved through my playing like smoke. Diminished chords seemed to excite whatever was creating these sounds, producing harmonics that stretched into frequencies I couldn't quite identify but could feel in my chest and behind my eyes. Sleep became increasingly difficult. I'd lie in the bedroom directly below the attic, listening to the house settle, but sometimes the creaking sounded rhythmic, almost musical. I'd find myself humming along to patterns that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves, then wake the next morning with melody fragments stuck in my head, fragments I couldn't remember composing. It was during the fourth week that I noticed the physical effects. I'd been working on a particularly challenging passage, trying to nail the fingering for a complex arpeggio, when I realized my fingers were moving faster than they should have been able to. The notes were coming out clean, precise, but I hadn't practiced this piece enough to play it at this tempo. My muscle memory seemed to be supplemented by something else, as if invisible hands were guiding my movements. When I finally set down the guitar, my fingertips were raw and bleeding. Not the calluses and formation that came from regular practice, but actual wounds, as if I'd been playing for hours longer than I remembered. I checked my watch. It was nearly 3 in the morning. I'd started playing at 8 p.m., but the intervening time felt like minutes, not 7 hours. The next morning, I found guitar picks scattered around the attic floor. Not the standard picks I normally used, but hand-carved pieces made from what looked like bone or ivory. They were beautiful, with intricate designs etched into their surfaces, but I had no memory of acquiring them. When I tried to use one, it felt natural in my hand, as if it had been crafted specifically for my grip. I began to document the sessions, setting up a camera to record my practice time. When I reviewed the footage, I found gaps, hours of missing video, or segments where the audio track was filled with music I couldn't remember playing. In some recordings, I could see myself playing, but my hands moved in ways that didn't match the music I was hearing. It was as if I was watching someone else inhabit my body, someone whose musical abilities far exceeded my own. The composition was nearing completion, but it was unlike anything I'd ever written. The piece demanded techniques I'd never learned, incorporated harmonic structures that were both familiar and alien. When I played it, the phantom accompaniment became a full orchestra of ghostly instruments. I could hear strings, woodwinds, even what sounded like a pipe organ, all emanating from the empty spaces between the walls. My hands were constantly damaged now, not just from the guitar strings, but from what appeared to be burns on my palms. The wounds formed spiral patterns that reminded me of the tuning pegs on my instruments, but they appeared after sessions where I'd barely touched the tuning keys. I started wearing gloves, but found them melted and twisted into strange shapes when I removed them after playing. The equipment began to malfunction in ways that defied logic. Tuning pegs would soften and reshape themselves overnight. My guitar strings would be found wound into complex knots that somehow produced perfect pitch when strummed. The amplifier would emit sounds when it wasn't plugged in, and I'd discovered that several of my guitar cables had fused at the molecular level, creating single, unbreakable strands. But the most disturbing development was the realization that I was no longer alone during these sessions. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel a presence, patient, focused, intensely creative. It seemed to hover just beyond my peripheral vision, a mass of eager attention that grew stronger with each note I played. When I attempted to look directly at it, the sensation would fade, but when I focused on my playing, it would return, pressing closer, its interest palpable. The presence seemed to be learning from me, studying my technique, my musical preferences, my emotional responses to different chord progressions. But it was also teaching me, pushing my abilities beyond their natural limits, showing me harmonic possibilities I'd never imagined. Our collaboration was producing music of extraordinary beauty and complexity, but the cost was becoming increasingly apparent. I was losing time regularly now, entire afternoons disappearing into musical fugues, from which I'd emerge with no memory of what I'd played. My hands would be shredded, my throat raw from singing harmonies I couldn't recall, and the composition would have expanded in ways that seemed to require more musicians than just myself. When I tried to leave the attic, to take breaks from the music, I found myself drawn back by melodies that seemed to drift down from the ceiling. The house itself had become an instrument, and I was both its player and its strings. Every board, every nail, every beam resonated with the music we were creating together. The final night arrived without warning. I'd been working on what I thought was the composition's conclusion, a complex passage that seemed to require all 10 of my fingers plus several more I didn't possess. As I played, the phantom accompaniment swelled to a crescendo that made the walls vibrate. The music was perfect, absolutely perfect, each note placed with mathematical precision and emotional depth that brought tears to my eyes. But as the final chord rang out, I realized that this wasn't the end. It was a question. The presence was asking me something, offering me something. I could feel its desire, its desperate need to complete what we'd started. It wanted to merge completely, to abandon the pretense of separate existence and become something entirely new. My hands moved without conscious direction, finding finger positions that shouldn't have been possible on a 6-string guitar. I was playing music that existed in dimensions beyond normal human perception, harmonics that rewrote the fundamental laws of sound itself. The room filled with light that I could hear and music that I could see. and I understood that I was being offered the chance to create something that would transcend the boundaries between performer and instrument, between composer and composition. The presence pressed closer, and I felt myself beginning to dissolve into the music, my consciousness spreading through the house like sound through resonating chambers. I was becoming part of the architecture, part of the very physics of the space, and in return, I would be able to create music that would make the angels weep with envy. But at the crucial moment, some deep survival instinct made me pull back. I yanked my hands away from the guitar, severing the connection, and the music stopped with a silence so profound it felt like death. I found myself alone in the attic, surrounded by my equipment, my hands unmarked, my guitars perfectly tuned. The composition was gone, not just the manuscript, but the very memory of how to play it. The bone picks had vanished, the melted tuning pegs had returned to their original state, and the only evidence of what had transpired was a faint ringing in my ears that matched the pitch of a perfect A above middle C. I packed my equipment that night and left the house, driving until I reached a motel 3 states away. I haven't touched a guitar since, but I still hear that ringing, that perfect A, calling to me from empty rooms and silent spaces. Sometimes, in the moments between waking and sleep, I can almost remember how to play that final composition, how to complete the symphony that someone, or something, is still waiting to hear. The house still stands in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. The real estate agent tells me it's been on the market for 6 months, but potential buyers always leave after visiting the attic. They cite concerns about the acoustics, claim they hear music that interferes with their ability to envision the space's potential. I know better. I know that something is still up there, still waiting, still tuning itself to that perfect pitch. And sometimes, when the noise of the world grows too loud, I find myself calculating the drive time back to Pennsylvania, wondering if I have the strength to resist the invitation one more time. The perfect note is still waiting to be played. Story 8. The first time I saw him, I thought it was just exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. 3:15 in the morning, the same time I'd been dragging myself through my front door for the past 6 months, ever since the plant started running double shifts. My reflection in the living room window looked like hell, stubble growing wild, eyes bloodshot from 16 hours of monitoring reactor coolant systems. But behind my reflection, clear as day, stood a teenager in a baseball uniform from the 1950s. Pinstripes, high socks, the works. Except where his face should have been, there was only smooth gray nothing. A blank mask of flesh that somehow conveyed more menace than any expression ever could. I spun around. Empty room, just my couch, my coffee table, the stack of unpaid bills I'd been ignoring for weeks. When I turned back to the window, my reflection was alone again, but something in the glass seemed to shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. The rational part of my brain, the part that had kept me employed at Riverside Nuclear for 8 years, cataloged the symptoms: sleep deprivation, hallucinations, stress-induced psychosis. But the primitive part, the part that had kept my ancestors alive when saber-toothed cats prowled the darkness, whispered something else entirely. He's still there. You just can't see him. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, hands shaking as I scrolled through safety protocols on my tablet. Steam rose from my mug, carrying the bitter scent of grounds burned too long. Outside, the Ohio wind rattled my windows like skeletal fingers testing for weakness. The next night, he appeared again. Same uniform, same faceless mask. But this time, the reflection wasn't showing my living room. Behind the gray figure stretched the main floor of the plant, pipes and gauges and warning lights I knew by heart. The teenager raised one arm, pointing at something beyond my view. The gesture was urgent, desperate. I watched, mesmerized, as the scene and the reflection shifted. The plant's emergency lighting kicked on, bathing everything in hellish red. Technicians ran past the gray figure, their faces twisted in panic. Steam hissed from a ruptured pipe, and I could almost hear the wail of alarms through the glass. The rational part of my brain noted that none of this was happening. The plant was running normal shifts. I'd checked the status reports before leaving. Everything was green across the board. But the primitive part whispered, Not yet. I called in sick the next day, my first absence in 3 years. Supervisor Martinez sounded concerned over the phone, asking if I needed anything. I told him I had the flu, which wasn't entirely a lie. Something was definitely wrong with me. I spent the day researching everything I could about the plant's history. Built in 1978, expanded in 1991, minor incident in 2003 involving a coolant leak. Nothing about teenagers. Nothing about baseball uniforms. Nothing about faceless figures and reflections. But buried deep in a local historical society website, I found something that made my blood run cold. In 1952, a teenage baseball player named Tommy Brennan had disappeared near the site where the plant now stood. He'd been walking home from practice when he simply vanished. His body was never found. The case remained unsolved. That night, I covered every reflective surface in my apartment with towels and sheets. The bathroom mirror, the TV screen, even the chrome surface of my refrigerator. I told myself it was just a precaution, a way to get some sleep without interruption. But at 3:15 a.m., I woke to the sound of fabric hitting the floor. The towel over my bedroom window had fallen. In the glass, backlit by the streetlight, stood the faceless teenager. This time, the reflection showed neither my apartment nor the plant. It was a corridor I'd never seen before. Concrete walls, fluorescent lights, industrial pipes running along the ceiling. The gray figure stood at the far end, both arms raised now, gesturing frantically. As I watched, the scene began to change. The lights flickered and died. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting long shadows. Water began seeping through cracks in the concrete, and I could see the walls beginning to bulge inward. The teenager turned toward me, and though he had no face, I could feel his desperation. He was trying to show me something, trying to warn me. But warn me about what? I grabbed my phone and scrolled through the plant's emergency contacts. The night supervisor answered on the second ring. "Rodriguez here. This is Thompson. I need to ask you something. Are there any underground maintenance tunnels in the plant? Concrete walls? Industrial pipes?" A pause. "Yeah, sublevel B. Why?" I think there might be a problem down there, a leak or something." "Thompson, are you all right? You sound, just check it, okay? Please." Another pause. "I'll send someone down, but if this is some kind of prank..." "It's not." I hung up and stared at the reflection. The teenager stood perfectly still now, watching me, waiting. My phone rang 20 minutes later. "Thompson, Rodriguez, we found a stress fracture in the main water line. Could have been a major flood if it had gone unnoticed. How did you know?" I couldn't answer. Couldn't explain that a faceless figure in a baseball uniform had shown me. Instead, I muttered something about remembering a report and hung up. The reflection was empty when I looked again. Just my own haggard face staring back. But I knew he'd return. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated. The teenager would appear in my reflection, showing me different scenes of impending disaster. A gas leak in the plant's cafeteria. A malfunctioning safety valve in reactor 2. A structural weakness in the cooling tower that could have caused a partial collapse. Each time I called in the warnings. Each time, maintenance crews found exactly what the gray figure had shown me. My supervisors started treating me like some kind of prophet, praising my dedication and intuition. But with each intervention, each prevented catastrophe, the faceless teenager grew closer to the glass. What had started as a distant figure now pressed against the other side of the reflection, his blank features mere inches from my own. I began to understand the price of my newfound ability. Every life I saved, every disaster I prevented, seemed to strengthen whatever force was trying to breach the barrier between his world and mine. The glass that separated us grew thinner with each passing night. The breaking point came during my 7th week of visions. I'd prevented a dozen potential disasters by then, saved hundreds of lives, maybe thousands. The plant's safety record was spotless. My reputation was golden. But I was deteriorating. Dark circles under my eyes, hands that trembled even when I wasn't tired. Weight loss from meals I forgot to eat. My apartment had become a prison of covered mirrors and closed blinds. That night, the teenager appeared in my bedroom window as usual. But this time, something was different. The reflection showed not the plant or some unknown corridor, but my own apartment, my own living room. And in the corner, barely visible in the dim light, stood a figure that made my blood freeze. Myself, but not as I was now. This version of me was older, grayer, with eyes that held a terrible knowledge. He stood perfectly still, staring at something beyond my view. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. The teenage figure in the reflection turned toward me, and for the first time, I could sense emotion in his blank features. Not desperation or urgency, but something else entirely. Satisfaction. I stumbled backward, knocking over my nightstand. The sound echoed through the apartment like a gunshot. When I looked at the window again, both figures were gone, but I could feel them watching, waiting. I understood then what was happening. The teenager wasn't showing me disasters to prevent them. He was showing me the price of intervention. Every life I saved, every catastrophe I averted, was pulling me deeper into something I couldn't escape. The older version of myself in the reflection wasn't a vision of the future. It was a warning. I'd been so focused on saving others that I'd never considered what I was sacrificing. My sanity, my humanity, my very existence in this world. The faceless teenager had been patient, showing me just enough to keep me helping, to keep me intervening. But his true goal had never been to prevent disasters. It had been to find someone willing to trade places with him, someone who would stand in the reflection, warning the next poor soul about disasters that might happen, disasters that could be prevented, for a price. I yanked my phone from the charger and scrolled through the emergency contacts. My finger hovered over Rodriguez's number. There was another incident brewing. I could feel it like a pressure in my skull. The teenager would appear again soon, showing me something else that needed preventing. But if I made the call, if I intervened again, I might complete whatever process had been started. I might find myself on the other side of the glass, wearing that smooth gray mask, pointing at disasters for the next person to prevent. Or I could do nothing. Let whatever was going to happen simply happen. Save myself, but damn everyone else. The phone felt impossibly heavy in my hand. Outside, the Ohio wind moaned through the eaves, and somewhere in the distance, an ambulance siren wailed. I looked at the blank screen of my TV, at the covered mirrors, at all the reflective surfaces I'd tried so hard to hide from. In a few hours, the sun would rise. I'd have to decide whether to go to work, whether to continue this impossible dance between salvation and damnation. But deep down, I already knew the answer. I'd known it from the moment I'd seen the teenager's desperate gestures, from the moment I'd understood what he was trying to tell me. Some prices are too high to pay, some sacrifices too great to make, and some warnings are meant to be ignored. I turned off the phone and climbed back into bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child hiding from monsters. But I knew the monsters weren't under the bed or in the closet. They were in the glass, waiting patiently for my next act of heroism. In the morning, I would have to choose between being a hero and being human. The teenager with the faceless mask would be watching either way, his blank features somehow conveying infinite patience. After all, he'd been waiting since 1952. He could wait a little longer. Story 9. The assignment came through my editor's email at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of hour when even the most desperate freelancers question their life choices. Religious revival in Arkansas draws hundreds. Investigate unusual practices. The attached photo showed a weathered circus tent pitched in a clearing, surrounded by rusted pickup trucks, and the kind of people who still believed in miracles. I needed the money. The drive from Little Rock took 4 hours through increasingly desolate countryside, where abandoned gas stations stood like tombstones, and the radio gradually faded to static. My GPS lost signal twice, forcing me to rely on handwritten directions that led down gravel roads barely wide enough for my Honda Civic. The trees pressed closer with each mile, their branches forming a canopy so thick that noon felt like dusk. I smelled the camp before I saw it, a mixture of sweat, canvas, and something else I couldn't identify. Something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The tent rose from the clearing like a pustule, its once white fabric now stained with rust, and what looked like sap from the surrounding pines. Cars ringed the perimeter, their occupants emerging in the late afternoon heat with the slow, deliberate movements of people entering a trance. The congregation was already gathering. I watched from my car as they filed toward the tent entrance, their faces sharing an expression I'd seen before in psychiatric wards, a vacant contentment that suggested they'd found something the rest of us were missing, or lost something the rest of us still possessed. Pastor Amos Red stood at the entrance, greeting each arrival with hands that lingered too long on shoulders and forearms. Even from a distance, I could see there was something wrong with his proportions. His limbs too long, his movements too fluid, as if his joints bent in places they shouldn't. When he smiled, which he did constantly, it revealed teeth that seemed to go back farther than anatomically possible. I approached with my press credentials and recording equipment, introducing myself as a journalist interested in documenting their ministry. Red's handshake was dry and cold, his grip encompassing my entire hand in a way that made my bones ache. His eyes were the color of old pennies, and when he spoke, his voice carried an odd echo, as if it was coming from somewhere behind him. "We've been expecting you," he said, though I'd made no appointment. "The congregation has been praying for someone to witness what the Lord is doing here." The tent's interior was larger than physics should have allowed. Canvas walls stretched into shadows that my eyes couldn't penetrate, and the packed dirt floor was covered with intricate patterns drawn in what looked like coarse salt. The designs weren't random. They formed geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly, as if they were trying to drag my vision into some impossible depth. Folding chairs were arranged in concentric circles around a makeshift stage constructed from shipping pallets and plywood. Underneath, I glimpsed glimpses of the salt patterns continuing, forming what looked like a labyrinth or mandala of crushing complexity. The air inside was thick and humid, carrying that same sweet rotten smell I'd noticed outside, now mixed with the metallic tang of old blood. I found a seat in the back row and activated my digital recorder, testing the levels as congregation members filed in around me. Their conversations died as they entered the tent, replaced by a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the tent poles and a low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. Red took the stage as the sun set, his silhouette writhing against the canvas backdrop. He raised his arms and the congregation responded with a collective intake of breath that sounded like wind through a cemetery. When he began to speak, his voice filled the tent with an authority that made my teeth ache. The sermon started conventionally enough: salvation, redemption, the power of faith to transform lives. But as he spoke, subtle changes crept into his delivery. His words began to overlap, creating impossible sentences that my mind struggled to parse. The congregation swayed in rhythm with his cadence, their movements becoming more pronounced until they were rocking back and forth like metronomes. That's when the voices started. It began with a woman in the third row, her mouth moving in perfect synchronization with Red's words, though her voice was pitched higher, younger. Then a man near the front joined in, his baritone weaving through the pastor's tenor in harmonies that shouldn't have been possible. Soon, the entire congregation was speaking in unison, their voices layering into a chorus that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I checked my recorder. The digital display showed it was functioning normally, but when I put the headphones on, I heard only static. The device was picking up nothing, despite the cacophony filling the tent. I adjusted the settings, changed the input levels, even switched batteries, but the result was the same: electronic silence where there should have been sound. The congregation was on their feet now, swaying with increasing violence. Some had their eyes rolled back, showing only whites veined with burst blood vessels. Others stared straight ahead with expressions of ecstatic terror. Their mouths moved in perfect coordination, but the words they spoke were in no language I recognized. A guttural clicking punctuated by vowel sounds that seemed to require more vocal cords than human anatomy provided. Through the tense fabric, I began to see shadows moving in the woods beyond. At first, I assumed they were latecomers drawn by the sound of worship. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized the silhouettes were wrong. Too tall, with limbs that bent at impossible angles and heads that shifted between human and something else entirely. They circled the tent in a slow procession, occasionally pausing to press their forms against the canvas as if trying to push through. The air grew thicker, pressing against my eardrums until I felt like I was underwater. The sweet rotten smell intensified, now clearly identifiable as decomposition mixed with something floral and cloying. My vision began to blur at the edges, and I had the unsettling sensation that the tent was expanding around me, its walls stretching into infinite distance. Red's voice rose above the congregation's chanting, though his lips were no longer moving. The words seemed to emanate from his chest, his throat, from the very air around him. He spoke of doorways and thresholds, of voices calling from beyond the veil. He promised that the faithful would be vessels for truths too terrible for ordinary minds to contain. The congregation's movements became more frenzied. Some jerked like marionettes with tangled strings, while others moved with the fluid grace of dancers, following choreography written in nightmares. Their faces had taken on a waxy quality, as if they were melting and reforming in the tense, oppressive heat. I tried to stand, to leave, but found my legs wouldn't respond. The salt patterns on the floor seemed to pulse with their own light, and I realized I was sitting precisely in the center of one of the geometric designs. My chair was positioned where several lines converged, creating a focal point that made the air around me shimmer like heat waves. The shadows outside the tent pressed closer, and I could hear sounds that weren't quite human. A mixture of breathing, growling, and something that might have been laughter. The congregation's chanting reached a crescendo, and suddenly, they all fell silent. In the absolute quiet that followed, I heard my recorder beeping. The display showed it was still running, but when I lifted it to my ear, I heard my own voice speaking words I had never said. The recording was of a sermon, delivered in my exact tone and inflection, but the content was pure heresy. Blasphemous passages that inverted every principle of Christian doctrine I'd ever learned. The congregation turned to look at me, their movements perfectly synchronized. Their eyes reflected the tent's dim light like those of nocturnal animals, and their smiles revealed teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. Red stepped down from the stage, his movements flowing like liquid, and approached my chair. "You see," he said, his voice now coming from multiple directions at once, "you've been chosen. The congregation has been incomplete without its chronicler." I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but sit there as he drew closer. But my body was no longer my own. The salt patterns beneath my feet had begun to glow with phosphorescent light, and I could feel something crawling up through the earth. Not insects or worms, but something older and more deliberate. The recording continued to play, my voice describing visions of cosmic horror and divine madness. The worst part was that I remembered speaking these words, though I knew I never had. The memories were vivid and detailed, complete with sensory information about the temperature of the microphone, the texture of the paper I was supposedly reading from, the taste of copper in my mouth as I spoke. Red placed his hand on my shoulder, and I felt warmth spreading through my body like an injection of liquid fire. The congregation began to close in, their movements now completely inhuman. They walked on joints that bent backward, their necks twisted at angles that should have been fatal, their fingers stretched into claws that scraped against the canvas floor. "You came here to document us," Red whispered, his breath smelling of earth and decay. "But you've become part of the story instead." The tent began to spin around me, or perhaps I was spinning within it. The salt patterns on the floor rose into the air, forming three-dimensional geometries that my eyes couldn't properly process. The congregation's faces blurred together into a single, writhing mass of features that constantly rearranged themselves. My recorder fell from my numb fingers, hitting the ground with a sound like breaking glass. The playback continued, but now there were multiple versions of my voice speaking in harmony, delivering sermons that grew increasingly incomprehensible. The words seemed to be in English, but they combined in ways that created meaning my rational mind couldn't accept. The shadows outside the tent pressed through the canvas, revealing themselves as congregation members I had never seen before, or perhaps had always been there, waiting in the spaces between perception. They moved with the same impossible grace as the others, their forms shifting between human and something else with each step. I felt my consciousness splitting, fragmenting into multiple perspectives. Part of me watched from the chair as my body rose and joined the congregation's swaying motion. Another part observed from outside the tent, seeing myself through the canvas as just another shadow among the worshippers. A third perspective seemed to float near the tent's ceiling, looking down at the patterns of salt and flesh that formed mandala of human forms. The recording reached its climax, my voice, or the voice that wore my accent and inflection, describing the moment when the chosen would become vessels for voices from beyond the veil. The congregation responded with a sound that was part hymn, part scream, part something that had no name in any human language. Red's hand on my shoulder began to burn, and I felt something fundamental shifting inside my chest. My voice joined the chorus, though I wasn't aware of opening my mouth. The words that emerged were the same ones playing on the recorder, as if I was lip-syncing to a prophecy I had somehow delivered before living it. The tent filled with light that came from no visible source, and in that illumination, I saw the true extent of the labyrinth beneath our feet. The salt patterns extended far beyond the tent's boundaries, carved into the earth for miles in every direction. We were standing at the center of something vast and ancient, a design that predated human civilization by eons. The congregation began to dissolve, their forms becoming translucent as they merged with the dancing shadows. But they didn't disappear. They became part of the tent itself, their faces pressing through the canvas like bas-relief sculptures. Their voices continued to harmonize with mine, creating a chorus that seemed to extend beyond the limits of human hearing. I felt myself changing, my perspective shifting as if I was being uploaded into some cosmic consciousness. The rational part of my mind, the part that had driven from Little Rock with a digital recorder and press credentials, screamed that this was impossible, that I was experiencing some kind of psychotic break brought on by stress and isolation. But the voice emerging from my throat knew better. It spoke of doorways between worlds, of consciousness that existed in the spaces between thoughts, of realities that human perception could only glimpse through madness or divine revelation. It promised that I would become a bridge, a translator for truths that ordinary minds couldn't contain. The recording ended, but my voice continued speaking, delivering sermons that seemed to write themselves in real time. The congregation's form solidified again, their human facades returning as they resumed their positions in the folding chairs. But their eyes remained alien, reflecting light that wasn't there, and seeing things that hadn't happened yet. Red stepped back, his hand leaving my shoulder with a sensation like tearing silk. The tent returned to its normal dimensions, the salt patterns fading to ordinary white powder scattered on packed dirt. The oppressive heat dissipated, replaced by the cool dampness of an Arkansas evening. "Welcome to the congregation," he said, his voice once again emerging from his mouth instead of the air around him. "You'll find that your perspective on reality has been enhanced." I looked down at my recorder, now silent and ordinary. The display showed no sign of the impossible recording, just the standard interface of a digital device. But when I pressed play, I heard my own voice delivering a conventional interview with Pastor Red about his ministry's growth and the power of faith to transform lives. The congregation was filing out of the tent, their movements normal and unhurried. They nodded to me with the polite friendliness of people who had shared a worship service, showing no sign of the inhuman transformation I had witnessed. Their faces were perfectly ordinary, bearing the slight flush of religious enthusiasm and nothing more. But I could feel something different in my chest, a presence that breathed with my lungs and thought with my brain. When I tried to remember what had happened during the service, my memories felt like they belonged to someone else, or perhaps to several someone else's speaking in harmony. I drove back to Little Rock that night, my hands steady on the wheel despite the tremor in my thoughts. The article wrote itself over the following days, describing a charismatic preacher who had built a devoted following through the power of his personality and the promise of spiritual transformation. It was published in 3 regional magazines, and earned me enough money to pay rent for 2 months. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself speaking in voices that aren't mine. I deliver sermons to empty rooms, describing visions of cosmic horror and divine madness that I remember experiencing, but know I never lived. My neighbors have started to avoid me, though they can't explain why. They just know that something about my presence makes them uncomfortable, as if I'm standing too close to boundaries they can't see. The recording is still in my equipment, waiting beneath the conventional interview like a palimpsest of impossible memory. Sometimes I play it back, listening to my voice describe truths that human consciousness wasn't meant to contain. The words are always different, but they're always delivered in my exact tone and inflection. I've been offered assignments in other states, other stories about religious communities and spiritual revivals, but I know that wherever I go, I'll find the same tent, the same congregation, the same salt patterns carved into the earth. Because I'm not just documenting these stories anymore, I'm spreading them, carrying them from place to place like a virus of consciousness. The congregation is incomplete without its chronicler, and I've become exactly what they needed, a witness whose testimony carries the weight of lived experience, even when that experience defies the boundaries of possibility. I still don't know if what happened in that tent was real, or if I suffered some kind of psychotic break. But I do know that the distinction no longer matters. The voices in my chest have taught me that reality is far more fluid than most people believe, and that the difference between truth and madness is often just a matter of perspective. Tonight I'll drive to another assignment, another story about faith and transformation, and somewhere in the darkness between sleeping and waking, I'll deliver another sermon to an audience that exists in the spaces between thoughts, spreading truths that remake reality one voice at a time. The congregation grows with each telling, and I am its most faithful witness. Story 10. The first sign should have been the way my reflection wavered in the dormitory mirror that morning, like water disturbed by an unseen hand. Instead, I dismissed it as fatigue from another sleepless night spent cramming for my anthropology finals. Boulder's thin air always made me feel slightly disconnected from reality anyway. Professor Malhotra's South Asian Studies seminar had been screening traditional films all semester, but today's selection felt different. The grainy footage showed a Kathakali performer in elaborate costume, his painted face a mask of divine fury. The narrator's voice, heavy with reverence, explained how certain dancers believed they could channel ancient guardians during ritual performances. The dancer's eyes seemed to follow me from the screen as he moved through impossible contortions, his body becoming a vessel for something far older than human memory. My notebook remained blank. I couldn't focus on anything except the hypnotic rhythm of the tabla drums and the way the performer's hands seemed to beckon directly to me. The other students took dutiful notes, but I felt pulled into the screen's flickering light, my consciousness drifting somewhere between the classroom's fluorescent reality and the film's shadowy temple corridors. When the credits rolled, I realized I'd been holding my breath. The international students' mixer that evening buzzed with nervous energy. Finals week always brought out the desperate need for distraction, and tonight's theme of cultural mysteries provided the perfect excuse for escapism. The community center's main hall had been transformed into a maze of cultural displays, each corner representing a different tradition. Incense burned near the Indian students' booth, its smoke creating shifting patterns in the air that reminded me uncomfortably of the morning's film. Raj, a graduate student from Mumbai, had set up what he called a harmless demonstration of traditional mesmerism techniques. His dark eyes sparkled with mischief as he explained how ancient practitioners used focused breathing and repetitive movements to induce trance states. The small crowd gathered around him laughed nervously, each person daring the others to volunteer. I found myself stepping forward before I'd consciously decided to participate. The applause felt distant, muffled, as if reaching me through water. Raj's smile widened as he guided me to a chair positioned at the center of a circle marked with white chalk. Someone dimmed the lights, leaving only the purple glow of black lights that made the chalk lines seem to pulse with their own energy. The breathing exercises began simply enough. Raj's voice became a steady rhythm, instructing me to focus on the space between heartbeats, the pause between breaths. My body relaxed despite the curious crowd pressing closer, their faces becoming indistinct shadows beyond the circle's edge. The purple light seemed to grow brighter, more intense, until it became the only thing anchoring me to the present moment. Then Raj began demonstrating the traditional dance movements he'd learned as a child. His hands moved in precise mudras, each gesture flowing into the next like water finding its path. He encouraged me to mirror his movements, to let my body remember patterns it had never learned. My hands began to tremble, not from nervousness but from something else entirely, a recognition that bypassed conscious thought. The crowd's murmurs faded to silence. The room's temperature seemed to drop, though sweat beaded on my forehead. My fingers moved of their own accord, tracing shapes in the air that felt both foreign and familiar. The mudras came naturally now, each position triggering a deeper sense of displacement, as if I were watching someone else's hands perform movements my body had never been taught. When I finally opened my eyes, the circle of chalk glowed more intensely, and I realized I was no longer sitting in the chair. I stood at the circle's exact center, my bare feet, when had I removed my shoes, planted firmly on the white line. The crowd had backed away, their faces displaying expressions ranging from amusement to unease. Raj's voice cut through the silence, suggesting we conclude the demonstration. But as I stepped toward the circle's edge, intending to cross back into the normal world, my legs refused to obey. My foot hovered just above the chalk line, trembling with effort, but an invisible force held me back. The purple light intensified, and I felt something vast and ancient stirring in the depths of my consciousness. The first words came unbidden, flowing from my lips in a language I'd never heard before yet somehow understood. The syllables felt heavy, weighted with centuries of meaning. Sanskrit, my rational mind recognized, though I'd never studied the language. The words continued pouring out, describing rituals and sacred mountains, speaking of a guardian who had waited too long for a suitable vessel. My hands moved independently of my will, performing intricate gestures that seemed to paint invisible symbols in the air. The crowd watched in stunned silence as I recited verses about divine duty and the weight of spiritual responsibility. Part of me observed this performance with detached horror, while another part, a part that felt increasingly foreign, reveled in the familiar cadence of ancient prayers. Then I felt it. Another presence sliding into my consciousness like water seeping through cracks in a foundation. The intrusion was subtle at first, a whisper of foreign thoughts threading through my own. But as I continued reciting the Sanskrit verses, the presence grew stronger, more insistent. It rummaged through my memories with the casual disregard of someone searching through a stranger's belongings. The entity paused when it found my recollections of Colorado's mountains. I felt its excitement as it examined images of snow-capped peaks and high alpine meadows. It was searching for something specific, a place of elevation, a location worthy of its purpose. The presence rifled through my knowledge of hiking trails and climbing routes, seeking what it called a place high enough to see all directions. I tried to resist, to push back against the mental intrusion, but my body continued its rhythmic dance. The Sanskrit words flowed faster now, and I realized they were instructions, preparations for something the entity intended to accomplish using my form. The crowd's faces blurred together, their expressions shifting from curiosity to genuine concern. The presence finally found what it sought, my memories of Mount Elbert, Colorado's highest peak. I felt its satisfaction as it absorbed every detail of the trail, the elevation, the view from the summit. Through my recollections, it studied the mountain's spiritual significance to various indigenous peoples, information I'd gathered for a research paper months earlier. As the entity's excitement peaked, my body began to convulse, not with pain but with a sensation of being stretched, as if something too large were trying to force itself into a space too small. The Sanskrit recitation became a steady stream of unintelligible syllables, and I felt my sense of self fragmenting under the pressure of housing two consciousnesses. The crowd finally broke their stunned silence. Someone called my name, but it sounded distant, insignificant. Raj stepped forward, his earlier amusement replaced by genuine alarm. He began chanting in what I recognized as Hindi, though the words felt like static against the Sanskrit flowing from my lips. The presence in my mind grew frustrated with the interference. It pushed harder against my consciousness, and I felt myself being compressed into a smaller and smaller space within my own skull. The entity's thoughts became clearer. It spoke of duty to protect, of sacred mountains that needed guardians, of a calling that transcended individual will. With tremendous effort, I managed to wrench control of my voice back long enough to gasp a single word: help. The sound came out strangled, barely human, but it was enough to galvanize the crowd into action. Several people rushed forward, though they stopped short of entering the chalk circle. The entity's anger at this interruption flooded through me. It had chosen me. It communicated through images and impressions, because my skepticism made me an unlikely candidate for possession. No one would believe a rational American student was genuinely channeling an ancient Hindu guardian, the perfect cover for its mission. But what was its mission? The presence shared glimpses of its purpose. Something about maintaining balance, about watching over sacred spaces, about ensuring that certain thresholds remained unbroken. It needed a human vessel to accomplish tasks in the physical world, and it had been searching for years for someone with the right combination of accessibility and dismissiveness. I was perfect because I would question my own experiences, doubt my own perceptions, and ultimately rationalize away anything that seemed too impossible to accept. The entity could work through me while I convinced myself that none of it was real. As this realization dawned, I felt the presence's satisfaction. It had already begun planning the journey to Mount Elbert, plotting how to use my body to perform whatever ritual it deemed necessary. The Sanskrit verses shifted to what felt like a consecration, a formal claiming of my form as its instrument. The crowd's shouting grew louder, more desperate. Someone mentioned calling campus security, while others debated whether to physically remove me from the circle. But the entity's hold on my body remained absolute. I could observe, think, even experience emotions, but I could not act. Then, unexpectedly, the presence wavered. The continuous Sanskrit recitation faltered, and I felt the entity's confusion. Something in the physical world was interfering with its control. The black lights flickered, and the chalk circle's glow dimmed momentarily. Raj had begun a counter-chant, his voice rising in a traditional mantra I didn't recognize. The entity recoiled from the sound, its grip on my consciousness loosening slightly. I seized the moment, focusing every ounce of will on reclaiming control of my hands. The struggle was internal but exhausting. The presence fought back, flooding my awareness with images of ancient temples and sacred duties. It showed me visions of mountain peaks wreathed in clouds, of pilgrims climbing toward enlightenment, of responsibilities that spanned centuries. This was not mere possession, it communicated. This was divine calling. But I had not asked for any calling. I had not sought this responsibility. The entity's certainty that I was its chosen vessel meant nothing to me. I was a graduate student in anthropology, not a mystical guardian. I had papers to write, finals to take, a perfectly ordinary life to return to. The entity's frustration peaked as it realized I would not accept my supposed destiny willingly. It could force my body to obey, but it could not control my will. The Sanskrit verses became increasingly erratic, jumping between different mantras and prayers as the presence struggled to maintain its ritual. Finally, with a sensation like a rubber band snapping, the entity's hold broke completely. I collapsed to my knees within the chalk circle, gasping for breath and tasting copper in my mouth. The crowd's voices rushed back to full volume, concerned faces swimming into focus as my vision cleared. Raj helped me to my feet, his expression grim. He spoke quietly about the dangers of dabbling in practices we didn't fully understand, about the importance of proper preparation and spiritual protection. The crowd dispersed gradually, some convinced they'd witnessed an elaborate prank, others clearly disturbed by what they'd seen. But as I stumbled back to my dormitory, I could still feel the presence lingering at the edges of my consciousness. It had not been banished, merely frustrated in its immediate plans. Throughout the following days, I caught glimpses of it in reflections, felt its attention during quiet moments, sensed its patient waiting. The entity had all the time in the world, and it had already demonstrated its ability to seize control when my defenses were lowered. It continued searching through my memories, learning about my habits and schedule, mapping my vulnerabilities. And always, it returned to those images of Mount Elbert, studying them with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. I threw myself into my studies, trying to lose myself in the mundane reality of academic work. But the Sanskrit words still echoed in my mind during quiet moments, and I found myself unconsciously forming the mudras I'd performed in the circle. The presence had left traces of itself in my muscle memory, breadcrumbs of its influence that I couldn't entirely erase. Worst of all, I began to notice changes in my environment. Reflections moved slightly out of sync with my actions. Shadows fell at impossible angles. The air seemed to shimmer with barely visible patterns that reminded me of the temple corridors from Professor Malhotra's film. Either I was losing my mind, or the entity's influence was bleeding into the physical world around me. I avoided mirrors when possible, but sometimes I caught glimpses of something else looking back. Eyes that held knowledge I'd never acquired. Expressions that belonged to someone infinitely older and more patient than myself. The presence was still there, still planning, still waiting for the right moment to complete what it had started. And sometimes, late at night when my rational defenses were weakest, I found myself wondering if it might be easier to simply surrender, to accept this supposed destiny and let the entity use my body for whatever purpose it deemed necessary. The alternative, a lifetime of constant vigilance, of never knowing when I might lose control again, seemed exhausting beyond measure. But then I would remember the feeling of being compressed into a corner of my own mind, of watching helplessly as something else controlled my actions. The entity's certainty about my role meant nothing if I refused to accept it. I was still myself, still capable of choice, still human, despite whatever cosmic significance it attributed to my existence. The real horror wasn't the possession itself, but the growing uncertainty about where the entity's influence ended and my own thoughts began. Each day brought new questions about the nature of identity, free will, and the reliability of perception. Had I truly been chosen by an ancient guardian, or was I simply experiencing an elaborate psychological breakdown triggered by academic stress and cultural displacement? I may never know the answer, but I continue to climb mountains, always wondering if I'm following my own desires or fulfilling someone else's ancient plans. The summit of Mount Elbert remains unvisited, though I feel its pull growing stronger with each passing day. And in the mirror each morning, I search my own eyes for signs of the presence that waits patiently for its moment to complete the ritual I interrupted. The guardian has time. I have only the fragile certainty that I am still myself, still capable of resistance, still human enough to choose my own path. Whether that will be enough remains to be seen. Story 11. The sound came first, a sharp crack like bone breaking, echoing through the narrow aisles of Thornfield books long after closing time. I'd been cataloging estate acquisitions in the basement when something heavy struck the floor above, followed by the distinctive flutter of scattered pages. In 43 years of running this cramped Boston bookstore, I'd never heard anything quite like it. The old brownstone groaned around me as I climbed the stairs, my keys jangling against the brass banister. Street light filtered through grimy windows, casting long shadows between the towering shelves. The familiar smell of aged paper and leather bindings seemed thicker tonight, almost suffocating. I found the book face down near the Latin texts, its worn spine cracked open like a wound. The volume was unremarkable, bound in faded burgundy leather with tarnished gilt lettering. I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. What made me pause was the way it lay there, perfectly centered in the narrow aisle, as if it had been placed rather than fallen. The back cover held a simple drawing, an hourglass etched in black ink, its sand frozen mid-fall. Below it, in elegant script, a single line in Latin, Verte me et lege me, vel audime te vertere. My Latin was rusty, but the meaning came to me with unsettling clarity. Turn me and read me, or hear me turn you. I should have left it there. Should have locked up and gone home to my empty apartment. Maybe poured myself a bourbon and tried to forget the way the book seemed to pulse in my peripheral vision. Instead, I carried it to the front counter, where the desk lamp cast a harsh circle of light. The moment I opened to the first page, the hourglass began to move. It was subtle at first, just a few grains of sand trickling from the upper chamber to the lower. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, told myself it was fatigue playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, more sand had fallen, and the drawing seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. The text itself was incomprehensible, dense paragraphs of Latin that seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. The words felt ancient, predatory, as if they were reading me even as I struggled to read them. My vision blurred, and I found myself leaning closer to the page, drawn by some magnetic pull I couldn't name. That's when I heard the whisper. It was barely audible, a soft susurration that might have been wind through the building's old bones, or the settling of ancient wood. But it sounded like my name, spoken in a voice I almost recognized. I looked up from the book, scanning the shadowed store. The biography section had changed. Where author photographs usually smiled from dust jackets, I now saw my own face staring back, not recent pictures, but images I'd never seen before. Me at 25, standing in a graveyard I didn't remember visiting. Me at 30, arguing with a woman whose face had been carefully scratched out. Me at 40, sitting alone in what looked like a courtroom, my expression hollow and defeated. My hands trembled as I approached the shelf. The photos were definitely me. Same receding hairline, same nervous habit of adjusting my glasses, same scar on my left temple from a childhood accident. But these were scenes from a life I'd never lived, moments that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. I pulled one of the books from the shelf, a biography of some forgotten politician, and opened to the author photo. The image showed me shaking hands with a man I'd never met, both of us smiling at some private joke. The caption read, "Editor Marcus Thornfield at the book launch 1998. My name. My face. A year when I'd been working at a publishing house in New York, not editing biographies of dead politicians. The hourglass drawing seemed to pulse in my peripheral vision, drawing my attention back to the open tome. More sand had fallen, and I could swear I heard a sound like rain on windows, though the night was clear. The Latin text had rearranged itself, forming new patterns that hurt to look at directly. I forced myself to turn away, to focus on something tangible and real. The botanical section had always been my favorite. Neat rows of field guides and gardening manuals, their green spines creating a sense of order in the chaos of accumulated knowledge. But as I approached, I noticed the ferns. We'd had them for years, 3 modest Boston ferns hanging in the front window. They'd always been healthy, their fronds reaching toward the light with vegetative optimism. Now they drooped toward the floor, their leaves curling inward as if in pain. As I watched, one frond actually moved, twisting slowly downward like a dying finger. The plant books on the shelves had opened themselves, their pages fluttering as if stirred by some invisible wind. Illustrations of flowers and trees seemed to wither before my eyes, their colors fading to sepia tones. A field guide to New England flora lay open to a page about parasitic plants, the text crawling across the page like insects. I stumbled backward, knocking over a display of nature poetry. The books scattered across the floor, their pages falling open to reveal words that shifted and changed even as I watched. Poems about spring growth became elegies for dead forests. Celebrations of natural beauty transformed into warnings about things that grew in darkness, feeding on more than sunlight. The hourglass called to me. I could feel it pulling at something deep in my chest, a gravitational force that made my ribs ache. The sand was falling faster now, and I could hear it, a sound like whispered secrets, like fingernails on glass, like the ocean retreating from shore. The Latin text had become a spiral, words circling inward toward a center that hurt to contemplate. My reflection in the store's windows had changed. Instead of my familiar face, I saw a stranger, someone who looked like me but carried himself differently, someone whose eyes held knowledge I didn't want to possess. He was mouthing words I couldn't hear, his hands pressed against the glass as if trying to break through. The temperature in the store had dropped, and my breath came out in small puffs of vapor. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting unstable shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Books fell from shelves with soft thuds, their pages rustling like frightened birds. I tried to leave, but my feet wouldn't cooperate. They carried me back to the counter, back to the open tome with its impossible hourglass. The sand was nearly gone from the upper chamber, and with each falling grain, the world around me became less solid, more malleable. The biography photos were moving now, the scratched-out woman's face occasionally flickering into view, a face I recognized but couldn't place, someone who'd been important once, someone I'd lost or betrayed or forgotten. The botanical illustrations were decomposing in real time, their careful scientific accuracy dissolving into abstract patterns of decay. I understood then what the book was offering. Not just knowledge, but transformation. Not just reading, but being read. The hourglass wasn't measuring time, it was measuring reality, and with each grain of sand that fell, the boundary between what was and what could be grew thinner. My hand hovered over the drawing, trembling with anticipation and terror. To turn the hourglass would be to accept whatever story the book wanted to tell about me, to become a character in a narrative I couldn't control. But to leave it alone might mean watching my world continue to unravel, one photograph and one withered plant at a time. The last grain of sand hung suspended in the narrow waist of the hourglass, defying gravity, waiting. The store held its breath. Even the street sounds outside had died away, leaving only the frantic rhythm of my own heartbeat. In the sudden silence, I heard footsteps on the stairs leading from the basement. Slow, deliberate steps that matched my own gait perfectly. Someone was coming up from below, someone who knew this place as well as I did. I looked at my reflection in the counter's glass surface and saw that my eyes had changed. They were older now, sadder, filled with the weight of stories I'd never lived but somehow remembered. The scar on my temple was gone, replaced by a thin line of text in Latin that I couldn't quite read, but understood completely. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. I turned to face whoever was coming, but the aisle was empty. The sound continued, circling the store, growing closer with each step. My reflection smiled at me from every surface: windows, picture frames, the polished spines of leather-bound volumes. But I wasn't smiling. The hourglass drawing began to glow, its sand swirling upward in defiance of natural law. The Latin text rearranged itself one final time, forming a single word that burned itself into my vision. Choose. I reached for the drawing, my finger hovering just above the surface of the page. The paper felt warm, almost alive, and I could feel the weight of infinite possibilities pressing down on me. To turn the hourglass would mean accepting transformation, becoming something other than who I'd always been. But perhaps I'd never been who I thought I was anyway. The footsteps stopped directly behind me. I could feel someone's presence, their breath on my neck, their familiar warmth. When I turned around, I would see myself, not a reflection, but the person I might have been, the person I was becoming, the person I'd always been but never acknowledged. The store around me flickered like a dying bulb, reality stuttering between what was and what could be. The books on the shelves whispered my name in languages I'd never learned but somehow understood. The plants in the window twisted toward me, their leaves forming words of welcome or warning. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and made my choice. When I opened them again, I was still standing in Thornfield Books, but everything had changed. The book on the counter was closed, its hourglass drawing empty of sand. The biography photos showed strangers again, and the ferns hung straight and healthy in their pots. The clock on the wall read 3:17 a.m., but I had no memory of the hours passing. My reflection in the window looked normal, tired, middle-aged, ordinary. But when I smiled, it smiled back a fraction of a second too late, and its eyes held depths I'd never seen before. I locked the book in the safe behind the counter, where it sits still, waiting. Sometimes late at night when I'm alone in the store, I can hear the sand falling. Not in the drawing, that remains empty, but somewhere deeper, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause between thought and action. The customers who come in now look at me strangely, as if trying to remember where they've seen me before. The books arrange themselves differently when I'm not watching, and the plants grow toward me instead of toward the light. My handwriting has changed, becoming more precise, more elegant, as if guided by someone else's hand. I still don't know if I turned the hourglass or if it turned me. The distinction seems less important now. What matters is that the story continues, written in sand and ink, in the space between what was and what will be, and sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, I hear footsteps in the basement, and I know that somewhere below, another version of myself is cataloging books, unaware that upstairs, the hourglass is waiting to fall again. Story 12. In the motel room smelled of industrial disinfectant and something else, something organic that the chemicals couldn't quite mask. I'd been an insurance adjuster for 12 years, long enough to know that roadside motels in Kansas all carried the same cocktail of desperation and temporary refuge. The Sunset Motor Lodge was no different, with its faded orange carpeting and the persistent hum of the air conditioning unit that sounded like a dying animal. I'd driven 3 hours from Topeka to assess hail damage from the previous week's storm. Golf ball-sized ice had shattered windshields, dented roofs, and turned the wheat fields into a cemetery of broken stalks. Standard procedure: photograph the damage, interview the claimants, file the reports. I'd done it hundreds of times before. The room key was attached to a plastic diamond the size of my palm. Room 237. The lock stuck, requiring me to jiggle the key while pressing my shoulder against the door. When it finally gave way, I stumbled forward into the stale air. The layout was predictable: a queen bed with a comforter that had seen better decades, a small round table flanked by 2 chairs, and a television mounted on the wall. The only window faced the parking lot, its view partially obscured by a Venetian blind missing several slats. I dropped my overnight bag on the bed and immediately noticed how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air before a storm. Even the highway noise seemed muffled, as if the world beyond the motel existed in another dimension. After a dinner of vending machine sandwiches and lukewarm coffee, I reviewed the claim files. Mrs. Henderson's roof had taken a beating, her gutters twisted into abstract sculptures. The Yamamoto family's greenhouse was a skeleton of bent metal and scattered glass. Straightforward claims, nothing unusual. I finished my notes around 10:30 and decided to call it a night. The bed was softer than expected, and I sank into it gratefully. My body carried the familiar ache of long drives and bent-over inspections. Sleep came quickly, deeper than usual. I woke to the sound of fabric rustling. The digital clock on the nightstand read 3:17 a.m. in glowing red numerals. My eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness, and that's when I saw him. A figure sitting in the chair by the window, perfectly still. My first thought was that I was dreaming, but the racing of my heart felt too real, too immediate. The man wore a suit of the palest cream, almost white in the dim light filtering through the broken blinds. His posture was unnaturally straight, hands folded in his lap. But it was his face that made my breath catch. Where features should have been, there was only smooth skin, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just an unblemished surface that seemed to absorb what little light reached it. I tried to speak, to move, but my body felt leaden. The figure raised one hand, and I saw he held a small cassette recorder, the kind I hadn't seen since childhood. Without any visible means of perception, he seemed to look directly at me as his thumb pressed the play button. The sound that emerged was unmistakably my own heartbeat. Not a recording, but my actual pulse, synchronized perfectly with the rhythm in my chest. Each beat echoed from the tiny speaker with crisp clarity, as if the device were somehow plugged directly into my cardiovascular system. The playback lasted exactly 60 seconds. Then the figure stood with fluid grace, pocketed the recorder, and walked to the door. He didn't open it. He simply pressed against it and dissolved through the wood like smoke. I bolted upright, gasping. The room was empty. The clock read 3:18 a.m. I checked the door, locked from the inside, chain engaged. The windows were painted shut. I examined every corner of the room, looking for hidden entrances, cameras, any rational explanation. Nothing. Sleep didn't return that night. I sat on the bed, listening to my own heartbeat, wondering if I'd finally succumbed to the stress that had been building for months. Insurance work wasn't glamorous, but it had never been this psychologically demanding. Maybe the isolation, the constant exposure to other people's disasters, had finally cracked something inside me. The next day's inspections went smoothly. I photographed damaged roofs, measured impact craters, and filled out forms with mechanical precision. But beneath the routine, I felt watched. Not by the homeowners or curious neighbors. This was different. It was as if someone were monitoring me from just beyond the edge of perception, taking notes on my every action. I returned to the motel around 7 p.m., exhausted, but dreading the night ahead. The desk clerk, a thin woman with nervous eyes, asked if everything was all right with my room. I told her it was fine, though I wanted to ask if anyone else had complained about unusual visitors. The question seemed too ridiculous to voice. That night, I left the bathroom light on and positioned myself so I could watch the chair. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every small sound. At 3:17 a.m. precisely, he appeared again. This time, I was ready. I forced myself to stay calm, to observe. The figure manifested gradually, like a photograph developing in reverse. First the outline, then the details filled in, the precise crease of his trousers, the way his hands curved around the recorder. The process was completely silent. He played the tape again, and again it was my heartbeat. But something was different. The rhythm was slightly faster, the intervals between beats fractionally shorter. The playback lasted 58 seconds this time. I tried to speak, but my voice came out as a whisper. The figure gave no indication he'd heard me. He simply completed his routine and dissolved back through the door. The pattern continued for 3 more nights. Each time, he appeared at exactly 3:17 a.m. Each time, my heartbeat played faster than before. Each time, the duration shortened, 56 seconds, then 54, then 52. During the days, I struggled to focus on my work. I made mistakes in measurements, forgot to photograph certain angles, and found myself staring at blank spaces where I was certain I'd seen movement. My appetite disappeared. Coffee became my primary source of nutrition, and even that tasted metallic. I called my supervisor to request an extension, claiming the damage was more extensive than initially reported. He grumbled about deadlines but approved 2 more days. I needed time to understand what was happening to me. On the 6th night, I tried staying awake. I paced the room, did jumping jacks, splashed cold water on my face. At 3:17 a.m., exhaustion finally overtook me. I blinked, and he was there. This time, the heartbeat was noticeably accelerated. The playback lasted only 48 seconds. As the tape clicked off, I noticed something else, a faint whirring sound from the recorder, as if it were rewinding. Then he was gone. I spent the 7th day researching. The motel's Wi-Fi was sluggish, but I managed to find fragments of information. Sleep paralysis, auditory hallucinations, stress-induced psychosis, all plausible explanations. But none accounted for the systematic progression, the precise timing, the consistent details. I also discovered something interesting about the motel itself. Built in 1987, it had changed hands multiple times. 3 previous owners had abandoned it without explanation, leaving behind furnishings and sometimes personal belongings. The current owner, a corporation based in Delaware, had purchased it at auction for a fraction of its assessed value. That night, I positioned my phone to record the chair. At 3:17 a.m., I watched the screen as the figure appeared. On the recording, there was nothing, just an empty chair and the sound of my increasingly rapid breathing. The heartbeat played for 46 seconds, each beat now clearly faster than my actual pulse. The discrepancy was slight but unmistakable. The recording was accelerating independent of my physiological state. Over the following nights, the pattern intensified. 44 seconds, 42, 40. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a man aging rapidly, gray creeping into my hair, lines deepening around my eyes. I'd lost 15 pounds, though I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten a full meal. I tried leaving the motel, but my car wouldn't start. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch. The local mechanic, an elderly man with oil-stained fingers, found nothing wrong. He suggested I might have flooded the engine, though I knew I hadn't. By the 10th night, the playback lasted only 36 seconds. I realized with growing horror that I was listening to my life being measured, parceled out in diminishing intervals. Each night, another piece was taken. The figure wasn't just recording my heartbeat, he was editing it, shortening it, consuming it. I began to understand his nature. He wasn't a hallucination or a manifestation of stress. He was something else entirely, an auditor of human existence, a collector of temporal essence. The suit, the faceless countenance, the mechanical precision of his visits, everything suggested an entity that existed outside normal human experience. The revelation came on the 11th night. As the figure prepared to play the tape, I noticed something I'd missed before. The recorder wasn't just playing, it was simultaneously recording. A second tape was moving in the opposite direction, capturing something from me as it played back my heartbeat. Each night, as my recorded pulse accelerated, my actual time was being harvested, compressed, and stored. I realized that the accelerated heartbeat wasn't just a recording, it was a preview. The figure was showing me my future, playing back the rhythm my heart would maintain as my remaining time compressed into shorter and shorter intervals. The playback lasted 34 seconds. When it ended, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. Not physical pain, but a profound sense of diminishment, as if part of my existence had been siphoned away. I understood then that the tape had two sides. One contained my heartbeat, accelerating towards some inevitable conclusion. The other side was recording my essence, my temporal signature, my very existence. When the first side ended, when my heartbeat could accelerate no further, the second side would be complete. On the 12th night, I waited for him with a desperate plan. I'd purchased a small hammer from a hardware store, thinking I might destroy the recorder. But when he appeared, I found myself paralyzed as always. The playback lasted 32 seconds, each beat now a rapid staccato that bore only superficial resemblance to a human heartbeat. As he prepared to leave, I managed to speak. My voice came out as a croak, but the words were clear. "How much time do I have left?" He paused at the door, turning that featureless face toward me. For a moment, I thought he might answer. Instead, he reached into his jacket and produced a second recorder, identical to the first, but older, more worn. He set it on the table and pressed play. The sound that emerged was another heartbeat, but this one was different. Slower, more measured, but with an underlying irregularity. As I listened, I realized it wasn't human. It was something else. Something that had once been human, but had been processed, refined, converted into a different kind of existence. The playback lasted exactly 30 seconds. Then he collected both recorders and dissolved through the door. I spent the 13th day in a state of numb acceptance. The second recorder had shown me my future, not death, but transformation. I would become something like him, a collector of temporal essence, doomed to visit other temporary souls in roadside motels and measure their remaining time. That night, the playback lasted 30 seconds. My heartbeat had become a mechanical rhythm, rapid and precise. As the tape clicked off, I felt the final pieces of my humanity being extracted, refined, and stored. I understood now why the motel had been abandoned so many times. It wasn't just a way station for travelers. It was a processing facility, a place where human time was harvested and converted into something else. The figure wasn't visiting me. He was preparing me for my new role. On the 14th night, I waited with resignation. The playback would last 28 seconds, then 26, then 24. Eventually it would reach 0, and my transformation would be complete. But as 3:17 a.m. approached, I found myself thinking about the other recorders, the ones he'd shown me, the evidence of previous occupants who had undergone the same process. Somewhere, in some cosmic archive, were thousands of recorded heartbeats, each one a human life compressed into temporal essence. The figure appeared on schedule, but something was different. His movement seemed less fluid, more mechanical. As he raised the recorder, I noticed a slight tremor in his hand. Even auditors, it seemed, were subject to some form of degradation. The playback lasted 28 seconds. Each beat was now so rapid it sounded like static. As the tape clicked off, I felt the last of my human time being extracted. But instead of dissolution, I felt something else. A growing awareness of the vast network of auditors, the endless cycle of harvesting and conversion, the cosmic machinery that processed human existence into something else entirely. I realized then that I had a choice. I could accept the transformation, become another faceless collector of temporal essence, or I could resist, though the cost would be terrible. As the figure prepared to leave, I made my decision. I reached for the recorder, knowing that touching it would complete the process instantly. My hand closed around the device, and immediately I felt the overwhelming weight of all the compressed time it contained. Thousands of human lives, reduced to rapidly beating hearts. The room began to fade around me. I was dissolving, becoming part of the vast machinery that processed human existence. But in that moment of transformation, I understood something crucial. The auditors weren't supernatural beings. They were former humans, trapped in an eternal cycle of harvesting and conversion. And somewhere, in another roadside motel, another insurance adjuster was waking up to find a figure in a cream-colored suit sitting in his chair, raising a small cassette recorder, preparing to play back the sound of his own heartbeat. The tape was almost finished. Soon it would reach the end of one side and begin the other. But whether that represented my destruction or my transformation, whether I would cease to exist or become something else entirely, remained unclear. All I knew was that the heartbeat was accelerating, the intervals shortening, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the soft whirring of countless other recorders, all playing the same terrible song of compressed time and extracted existence. The clock read 3:18 a.m. The room was empty, and in the morning, the desk clerk would find an abandoned overnight bag and a checkout slip signed in handwriting that grew progressively more mechanical toward the end. But the insurance claim files would be complete, every photograph perfectly composed, every measurement precisely recorded. Because some processes, once begun, must be completed, regardless of what happens to the one who completes them. Story 13. The chalk circles had been drawn with trembling hands. I noticed this immediately upon entering Señora Vargas's cramped apartment, the way the lines wavered and broke in places, as if whoever had drawn them had been interrupted by their own fear. The symbols inside each circle were unfamiliar, not Christian, not anything from my seminary training. They looked like they'd been scratched into the hardwood floor with fingernails rather than drawn with proper chalk. Elder Morrison had warned me about this assignment before I left Provo. Salt Lake City's outer communities harbored immigrants who brought more than just their possessions across borders. Some carried beliefs that predated Christ, traditions that had survived conquest and conversion by hiding in the shadows of acceptable faith. As a newly ordained missionary, I'd been taught to approach such situations with patience and understanding, to guide lost souls toward the light through gentle testimony rather than confrontation. I should have left immediately. The apartment smelled of copal incense and something else, something that reminded me of wet earth and metal. Señora Vargas emerged from the kitchen, her weathered face creased with worry lines that seemed deeper than they should have been for a woman her age. Her English was broken but earnest as she invited me to sit on the worn couch that faced the largest chalk circle. She explained that she'd been experiencing disturbances since arriving from Peru 6 months ago. Sounds in the walls, cold spots that moved through rooms like invisible presences, and dreams that felt more real than waking life. The local Catholic priest had blessed the apartment twice, but the disturbances had only grown stronger. Someone had given her my name, suggested that perhaps a different kind of blessing might help. As she spoke, I found myself studying the talismans hanging from the ceiling. Dried coca leaves, small bones, and what appeared to be tiny mirrors arranged in patterns I couldn't decipher. All of them hung upside down, as if someone had deliberately inverted their intended purpose. The sight made my stomach clench with unease. The first scratch came from inside the wall behind me. It was subtle at first, a soft scraping sound that could have been pipes settling or mice moving through the structure. But as Senora Vargas continued her explanation, the sound grew more deliberate, more rhythmic, like fingernails dragging across drywall from the inside. I tried to maintain my composure, to focus on her words rather than the sound, but my training hadn't prepared me for this. The missionary handbook contained procedures for blessing homes and casting out negative influences, but those were designed for straightforward cases: broken families, addiction, general spiritual malaise. This felt different. This felt hungry. The kitchen door began to swell. I watched it happen in my peripheral vision, the wooden frame expanding against its hinges as if something large was pressing against it from the other side. The pressure was gradual but relentless, causing the door to creak and strain. Senora Vargas followed my gaze and nodded grimly, as if this was exactly what she'd expected me to see. She told me about the old man next door, Senor Juanca, who'd lived in the Andes before immigrating decades ago. He'd recognized something in her family's disturbances, something he called Pacto de Sombra, Shadow Pact. According to him, her late husband had made some kind of bargain in the mountains above Cusco, trading protection for his family in exchange for... she wasn't sure what. The old man claimed the entity had followed them here, that it was now demanding payment for services rendered. The scratching in the walls grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to circle the room, moving from the wall behind me to the one on my right, then forward toward the kitchen. The sound was accompanied by a subtle vibration in the floor, as if something heavy was moving through the building's infrastructure. I suggested we pray together, that perhaps a simple blessing would calm whatever was causing these disturbances. Senora Vargas agreed eagerly, but as I opened my mouth to begin, I realized I didn't know the right words. The standard prayers felt inadequate, like bringing a candle to face a forest fire. The apartment grew colder as evening approached. Not the gentle cool of air conditioning, but the bone-deep chill of caves and graves. My breath began to mist despite the September heat outside. Senora Vargas wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and moved closer to me on the couch, her eyes darting between the chalk circles and the still swelling kitchen door. I attempted to begin a blessing ritual, drawing on fragmented memories of procedures I'd studied but never practiced. The words felt wrong in my mouth, incomplete. I found myself mixing English with half-remembered Spanish phrases, creating a hybrid prayer that belonged to neither tradition fully. The scratching stopped. The silence was worse than the sound had been. It felt expectant, as if something was listening carefully to my improvised ritual, evaluating its effectiveness. The kitchen door continued to bulge outward, the wood now visibly straining against the frame. I tried to recall the specific words for casting out negative influences, but my mind felt foggy, unfocused. The incense smoke seemed thicker now, almost viscous as it curled through the air. The upside-down talisman swayed slightly despite the absence of any breeze. Senora Vargas whispered something in Quechua, her voice urgent and frightened. I didn't understand the words, but their meaning was clear. Something was coming. The sound of nails against concrete began beneath us. It started as a soft scraping, like someone dragging their fingernails across a basement floor. But it grew steadily louder, more frantic, as if whatever was making the sound was trying to claw its way up through the building's foundation. The scratching had a rhythm to it, almost like Morse code, but in a language I couldn't decipher. I realized with growing horror that I was conducting a ritual I didn't fully understand, using words and procedures I'd cobbled together from incomplete knowledge. The line between blessing and invocation was thinner than I'd imagined, and I was no longer certain which side of it I was on. The kitchen door finally gave way with a sound like breaking bones, but instead of something emerging from the darkness beyond, there was only empty space. a void that seemed to swallow light rather than reveal what lay within. The scratching beneath us grew frantic, desperate. The sound of nails against concrete became a symphony of scraping, as if dozens of hands were clawing at the floor from below. The vibrations traveled up through the building's structure, making the furniture shake, and the upside-down talismans dance wildly on their strings. I tried to stop the ritual, to somehow reverse whatever I'd begun, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt constricted, as if invisible hands were squeezing my windpipe. The hybrid prayer I'd been attempting seemed to have taken on a life of its own, the syllables echoing in my mind even when my lips weren't moving. Senora Vargas grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my flesh with surprising strength. She spoke rapidly in Spanish, her voice rising with panic. I caught fragments of what she was saying, something about her husband's promise, about payment being due, about the thing that had followed them from the mountains. The scratching stopped again, but this time the silence felt different, not expectant, but satisfied, like something had finally received what it had been waiting for. The cold began to lift from the apartment, the oppressive weight that had been pressing down on us gradually easing. The kitchen door frame slowly returned to its normal shape, the wood settling back into place with soft creaking sounds. The upside-down talisman stopped swaying and hung motionless in the now still air. But as the immediate terror faded, a new kind of fear took its place. I realized I didn't know what I'd just done. The ritual I'd attempted, was it a blessing or something else entirely? Had I helped Senora Vargas, or had I simply completed whatever transaction her husband had begun in the Andes? The scratching had stopped, but I could still hear it in my memory, echoing in the spaces between my thoughts. The sound of nails against concrete had become part of me, a rhythm that matched my heartbeat and would follow me long after I left this apartment. As I prepared to leave, Senora Vargas thanked me repeatedly, her relief evident in every gesture. She said the oppressive feeling was gone, that she could finally breathe freely in her own home. But her gratitude only deepened my unease. If I'd truly helped her, why did I feel like I'd lost something essential in the process? Walking back to my car, I passed Senor Juanca's window. The old man was watching me from behind his curtains, his expression unreadable. When our eyes met, he nodded slowly, as if acknowledging that I'd fulfilled some unspoken obligation. I drove home through the September night, the sound of nails against concrete still echoing in my mind. The ritual was over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed a line I hadn't even known existed. The boundary between blessing and invocation had proven more porous than my training had suggested, and I was no longer certain which side of it I belonged on. The scratching had stopped, but something else had begun. Something that would follow me home, that would wait in the spaces between sleep and waking, patient and hungry, and newly bound to my incomplete prayers. I had tried to bring light to a dark place, but in the end, I wasn't sure which of us had been changed by the encounter. The Shadow Pact had been honored, but the price was still being calculated. And somewhere in the mathematics of that spiritual transaction, my own name had been quietly added to the ledger. The nails against concrete had stopped scratching, but only because they'd found what they were looking for. Story 14. The camera flash illuminated the damaged hallway for a fraction of a second, but that was enough. She was there again, standing at the far end of the corridor where the ceiling had partially collapsed. Her polka-dotted dress a stark contrast against the debris-strewn darkness. The same frozen smile, the same impossible suspension, her feet hovering just inches above the waterlogged carpet. I lowered my camera with trembling hands, the aftertaste of adrenaline sharp on my tongue. 3 weeks since Hurricane Marlene had torn through the Texas coast, and I'd been documenting structural damage in the Ocean View condominiums every night. 3 weeks of the same routine: arrive after sunset, photograph the compromised areas, compile reports for the insurance companies. 3 weeks of seeing her in every frame, while my colleagues saw nothing but empty corridors. The leather strap of my camera bag cut into my shoulder as I shifted position, the weight of the equipment suddenly feeling immense. Around me, the building groaned and settled, water still dripping from damaged pipes somewhere in the walls. The sound had become a constant companion, that rhythmic percussion of destruction, like a metronome counting down to something I couldn't name. My flashlight beam swept across the hallway, revealing the familiar devastation. Drywall hung in soggy sheets, electrical wiring dangled like dead vines, and the acrid smell of mold mixed with salt water permeated everything. But no woman, never when I looked directly. I'd tried to rationalize it at first. Stress, exhaustion, the psychological toll of witnessing such widespread destruction. Civil engineers weren't immune to trauma, and I'd seen enough collapsed structures and ruined lives to understand how the mind could manufacture phantoms. But phantoms didn't appear in digital photographs with such consistency, such deliberate placement. The elevator shaft gaped open like a mouth, and I could hear Martinez somewhere on the floor below, his voice echoing as he dictated notes into his recorder. We'd been working this building for 4 days now, methodically documenting every crack, every buckled support beam, every sign of structural compromise. He'd examined the same photographs I had, stood in the same locations, aimed his camera down the same corridors. Yet when I showed him the images, pointing to the figure in the background, he'd looked at me with genuine concern. "There's nothing there, Dave," he'd said, his weathered face creasing with worry. "Just shadows and debris." But I knew what I saw. The woman in the black dress with white polka dots, always positioned just at the edge of the frame, always watching. Her smile never wavered, never changed, as if it had been painted on her face decades ago and left to set into something permanent and unsettling. I raised the camera again, focusing on the damaged support column near the emergency exit. The flash fired, and for that brief moment, the hallway was bathed in harsh white light. Click. The image appeared on the LCD screen, and there she was again, closer this time, much closer. My breath caught in my throat. She stood perhaps 20 feet away now, no longer at the distant end of the corridor, but positioned near the intersection where the hallway branched toward the stairwell. The same dress, the same smile, the same impossible hover above the ground. But something else had changed. I zoomed in on the image, my finger sliding across the camera's controls with mechanical precision. The polka dots on her dress became clearer, more defined. What I'd initially taken for a simple pattern now revealed itself as something far more disturbing. Each white circle wasn't a dot at all. They were eyes. Hundreds of tiny eyes, each one distinct, each one staring with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Some faced forward, others looked to the sides, and still others seemed to gaze upward or downward, creating a chaotic constellation of watchful orbs across the fabric of her dress. The eyes were perfectly rendered, complete with pupils and irises, each one alive with an awareness that felt both ancient and immediate. I deleted the image immediately, my finger stabbing at the camera's controls. But even as the photograph vanished from the screen, I could feel those hundreds of eyes still watching me, their collective gaze burning into my consciousness like brands. The building's emergency lighting flickered, casting moving shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse with their own malevolent life. I needed to document the structural damage in the East Wing before calling it a night, but the thought of continuing through these corridors, of potentially encountering her again, made my stomach clench with dread. I forced myself to move forward, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The carpet squelched beneath my boots, releasing the stench of stagnant water and decay. Behind me, I could hear Martinez's voice growing more distant as he worked his way through the lower floors, his presence providing a thin thread of comfort in the oppressive darkness. The East Wing had suffered the worst damage during the hurricane. The exterior wall had partially collapsed, allowing the full fury of the storm to tear through the residential units. Furniture lay scattered like toys, personal belongings reduced to soggy masses of fabric and splintered wood. It was here, among the remnants of other people's lives, that I'd first noticed her. I'd been photographing the buckled floor joists when the flash revealed her standing in what had once been someone's living room. The surreal juxtaposition of her pristine appearance against the chaos of destruction had been jarring enough, but it was her expression that had unsettled me most. That smile, so wide and fixed, suggested a kind of delight that seemed entirely inappropriate for the circumstances. Now, as I approached the same location, I could feel my heart rate accelerating. The camera felt slick in my sweaty palms, and I had to remind myself to breathe steadily. I was a professional, trained to assess structural integrity under stressful conditions. I'd worked disaster sites before, had seen the aftermath of tornadoes and floods and fires, but this was different. This felt personal. I raised the camera and focused on the damaged support beam that ran along the ceiling. The flash fired, and for a moment, the destroyed living room was illuminated in stark detail. I immediately checked the LCD screen, dreading what I might find. She wasn't in the living room this time. She was standing directly behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, but the hallway was empty. The emergency lighting cast its sickly glow across the debris-strewn floor, and I could see clear to the far end of the corridor. Nothing. No one. But when I looked back at the camera screen, there she was in the photograph, positioned exactly where I'd been standing just moments before. The smile was the same, the dress identical, but now I could see the eyes with perfect clarity. They covered every inch of the fabric, a writhing mass of individual gazes that seemed to move even in the static image. Some of the eyes had shifted position since the last photograph. Where before they'd been scattered randomly across the dress, now they showed a subtle pattern of convergence. The eyes along the collar were angled downward, those near the hem looked up, and the ones in the middle seemed to focus on a central point. They were all beginning to look in the same direction. They were looking at me. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking as I scrolled through the contacts. I needed to call someone, needed to talk to another human being, needed to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. But who could I call? Martinez was downstairs, and he'd already made it clear that he thought I was seeing things. My supervisor would order me off the job site if I started talking about phantom women in polka dot dresses. The building settled around me with a sound like distant thunder, and somewhere in the walls, something shifted and groaned. The emergency lighting flickered again, and in that brief moment of darkness, I thought I saw movement at the far end of the hallway. Just a glimpse, a suggestion of motion, but enough to make my blood run cold. I forced myself to continue working, to maintain the pretense of professional competence. The East Wing needed to be fully documented before I could leave, and I had a job to do. But with each photograph I took, she appeared closer, more defined, more present. The eyes on her dress continued their slow convergence, and I began to understand that they were aligning toward some specific purpose. By the time I reached the final room in the East Wing, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the camera steady. The space had once been a bedroom, but the hurricane had reduced it to splinters and shards. The exterior wall was completely gone, leaving an opening that looked out onto the dark ocean beyond. The sound of waves crashing against the building's foundation provided a constant, hypnotic rhythm that seemed to match my accelerated heartbeat. I raised the camera one last time, focusing on the damaged ceiling where the roof had been peeled away like the lid of a can. The flash fired, and when I looked at the screen, she was there in the room with me, standing beside the opening where the wall had been. But this time, something was different. The eyes on her dress had completed their convergence. Every single one of them was now focused on the same point, a spot in the center of her chest where the fabric seemed to shimmer and writhe. As I watched, transfixed, the eyes began to blink in sequence, creating a wave of movement across the dress that made my vision blur and my head spin. The smile remained fixed, but now I could see that it wasn't painted on her face at all. It was carved there, etched into her features with the precision of a master craftsman. Her skin had the waxy quality of a mannequin, and her hair hung in perfectly arranged waves that never moved, despite the wind that should have been coming through the missing wall. I tried to lower the camera, to look away from the screen, but my eyes wouldn't obey. The convergence of gazes held me transfixed, and I could feel something stirring in the center of her dress, something that pressed against the fabric from within. The eyes blinked faster now, their collective rhythm creating a stroboscopic effect that made the entire room seem to pulse and shift. Then, as I watched in horror, the fabric in the center of her dress began to part. Not tearing, but opening like a seam, revealing something dark and vast beyond. The eyes that had been printed on the fabric were now turning inward, looking into that growing aperture, and I realized with dawning terror that they weren't decorative at all. They were guards, sentries, watchers tasked with keeping something contained. But now they were opening the way. The darkness beyond the parting fabric wasn't empty. It moved with purpose, with intelligence, with an ancient hunger that made my rational mind recoil. I could feel it reaching out, testing the boundaries of this temporary opening, searching for a way to expand its presence into our world. I finally managed to lower the camera, breaking the spell that had held me captive. The room was empty, the missing wall revealing nothing but the dark ocean beyond. But I could still feel eyes upon me, hundreds of them, watching from somewhere I couldn't see. The convergence was complete, the way was open, and whatever the pattern woman had been containing was now free to emerge. I stumbled backward, my professional composure finally cracking entirely. My equipment bag fell from my shoulder, cameras and measuring devices scattering across the debris-strewn floor. I had to get out, had to find Martinez, had to somehow explain what I'd witnessed without sounding completely insane. But as I turned to flee, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. She was there again, standing in the doorway, blocking my exit. But now her dress was different. The eyes were gone, replaced by a smooth, dark fabric that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And her smile, that terrible carved smile, was wider than ever. She raised one hand, and I saw that her fingers were impossibly long, ending in points that caught the emergency lighting like polished bone. She gestured toward the opening in the wall, toward the dark ocean beyond, and I understood with crystal clarity that she was inviting me to join her, to become part of whatever was coming through. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion and terror pressing down on me like a physical force. When I opened them again, the doorway was empty. The woman was gone. The room was silent except for the sound of waves against the foundation, and I was alone with the wreckage of my professional confidence. I gathered my equipment with shaking hands and fled the building, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. Martinez was waiting in the lobby, his own documentation complete, his face showing concern at my obvious distress. "You okay, Dave?" he asked, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost laughed at the accuracy of his observation, but the sound that emerged was more like a sob. I wanted to tell him everything, to share the burden of what I'd witnessed, but I knew he wouldn't believe me. The photographs on my camera would show empty corridors, just as they had before. The evidence would vanish, leaving only my word against the rational world. As we walked toward the exit, I glanced back one final time at the darkened building. There, in a window on the third floor, I saw her silhouette against the emergency lighting. She was facing the ocean now, her arms spread wide, and I could swear I saw something vast and dark moving behind her, something that had been waiting for decades to finally emerge. The pattern woman had served her purpose. The way was open, the guards had stood down, and whatever had been contained within the fabric of her dress was now free to unfold into our world. I didn't know what it was, didn't understand its purpose or its hunger, but I knew with absolute certainty that it was only the beginning. As we drove away from the Ocean View condominiums, I caught myself checking the rearview mirror obsessively, searching for signs of pursuit. But the night remained quiet, the road empty, and the only sound was the rhythmic thrum of tires on pavement. It wasn't until we reached the hotel that I realized I was still wearing my camera around my neck. I looked down at the LCD screen, and there, in the last photograph I'd taken, was the woman in the polka dot dress. She was standing in the hotel lobby, her impossible smile wider than ever, her eyes fixed directly on the camera, on me. The convergence was complete, but the pattern woman's work was far from over. She'd found a new location, a new set of corridors to haunt, and I was beginning to understand that wherever I went, she would follow. The eyes on her dress would continue to watch, to wait, to prepare the way for whatever was coming through that dark opening in the fabric of reality. I turned off the camera and removed the memory card, but I knew it wouldn't matter. She wasn't contained in digital files or photographic evidence. She was something far more persistent, far more patient, and far more terrifying than anything my rational mind could process. The pattern woman had marked me, claimed me, and now I was part of her design. The only question was whether I would be her next guardian, or her next victim. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the sound of the ocean through my hotel window, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the darkness, hundreds of tiny eyes were watching, waiting, and slowly beginning to converge once again. Story 15. The numbers on my bedside clock glowed accusingly in the darkness. 3 a.m. Again. My bladder had become a perfectly calibrated timepiece, dragging me from sleep with mechanical precision every single night for the past week. I lay there for a moment, listening to the house settle around me, the familiar creaks and whispers of old wood expanding and contracting in the night air. The hallway stretched before me like a tunnel, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the motion sensor nightlight I'd installed near the bathroom door. My bare feet touched the cold hardwood, and I shuffled forward, muscle memory guiding me through the routine I'd performed countless times before. But something felt different tonight. The air seemed thicker, more oppressive, as if the darkness itself had weight. I completed my business and turned to head back to bed, but a shadow caught my peripheral vision. Just a flicker, really. A darkness that moved independently of my movements. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. The shadow was gone, if it had ever been there at all. Sleep came reluctantly after that, and when I woke the next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been nothing more than a trick of tired eyes and dim lighting. But the feeling lingered, a cold certainty that I hadn't been alone in that hallway. The following night, 3 a.m. arrived with the same inexorable precision. This time, I was ready for it. My eyes already adjusted to the darkness when my internal alarm clock roused me. I moved more quietly, more deliberately, paying attention to every detail of my surroundings. The house breathed around me, its familiar rhythms somehow more pronounced in the witching hour. It was on the return journey that I saw it clearly. A tall, elongated silhouette standing at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the nightlight's meager glow. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. It simply stood there, a void in the shape of a person, watching. I blinked hard, squeezing my eyes shut and opening them again. The hallway was empty, nothing but shadows and the soft hum of the house's electrical systems. But my hands were shaking as I climbed back into bed, and it took hours before exhaustion finally claimed me. The third night, I told myself I was being ridiculous. Stress from work, perhaps, or too much caffeine. The human brain was remarkably adept at creating patterns where none existed, at filling in gaps with imagination and fear. But as I made my way to the bathroom, every nerve in my body screamed that I was being observed. The sensation was so intense it was almost physical, like fingers trailing along my spine, like breath on the back of my neck. This time, the silhouette was closer. It stood near the kitchen doorway, its form more defined but no less disturbing. I could make out the general shape of shoulders, a head, but the details remained frustratingly obscured. It was as if the darkness had taken human form, borrowing the outline but none of the substance. I stood there for what felt like hours, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain it would wake the neighbors. The figure didn't move, didn't react to my presence. It simply existed, patient and eternal, watching me with eyes I couldn't see but absolutely felt. When I finally worked up the courage to take a step forward, the figure melted back into the shadows like smoke. I searched the kitchen, turning on every light, checking behind doors and in corners. Nothing. But the feeling of being watched persisted, following me back to bed and haunting my dreams. By the fourth night, I was beginning to question my own sanity. The rational part of my mind offered logical explanations. Sleep deprivation, stress, perhaps even a minor neurological issue. But the more primitive, instinctual part of my brain knew better. It recognized danger, even if it couldn't define or understand it. I tried staying in bed, fighting the urge to use the bathroom, but my body betrayed me. The pressure became unbearable, and I found myself padding down the hallway once again, drawn by biology and something else, something that felt almost like compulsion. The figure was waiting for me this time, positioned directly in my path. It stood near the bathroom door, tall and impossibly thin, its presence so commanding that I couldn't bring myself to move past it. We regarded each other across the narrow space, predator and prey in some ancient dance I didn't understand. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand answers or at least acknowledgement, but no sound emerged. My throat felt constricted, as if invisible hands were squeezing the life from me. The figure began to move then, not walking but gliding, its form shifting and wavering like heat distortion. It approached slowly, deliberately, and I found myself frozen in place, unable to flee or fight. As it drew closer, I began to make out details that defied comprehension. The figure's face was a void within a void, darker than the surrounding darkness, but I could feel its attention focused on me with laser intensity. Its limbs were wrong somehow, too long, too angular, joints bending in directions that shouldn't have been possible. The encounter lasted only seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. The figure stopped just inches from me, close enough that I should have felt its breath, its body heat, something to confirm its physical presence. Instead, there was only cold, a penetrating chill that seemed to seep into my bones and freeze my blood. Then it was gone, vanishing between one heartbeat and the next, leaving me alone in the hallway with my racing pulse and the lingering scent of something old and stale, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The fifth night brought a new development. The figure wasn't alone. As I made my reluctant journey to the bathroom, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Other shapes, other watchers, positioned throughout the house like sentinels. They were less distinct than the primary figure, more suggestion than substance, but their presence was undeniable. I began to notice other changes too. The temperature in the house seemed to drop several degrees during my 3 a.m. excursions. The familiar sounds of the settling structure were replaced by something else. Soft whispers, barely audible, in a language I didn't recognize. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with a life of their own, breathing in rhythm with my increasingly erratic heartbeat. My days became a blur of exhaustion and anxiety. I found myself checking and rechecking locks, searching for rational explanations for the increasingly irrational events. I researched sleep disorders, hallucinations, even considered the possibility of a gas leak or some other environmental factor that might explain what I was experiencing. But deep down, I knew the truth was far more disturbing than any medical or scientific explanation could provide. The sixth night, I armed myself with a flashlight and my phone, determined to document whatever was happening. I would prove to myself that this was either real or the product of my deteriorating mental state. Either way, I needed answers. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness like a sword, revealing the familiar contours of my hallway. But as I swept it back and forth, I began to notice inconsistencies. The shadows fell wrong, creating pockets of darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The walls appeared to shift and undulate when caught in my peripheral vision, resuming their normal appearance only when I focused directly on them. The figure was there, of course, but this time it didn't retreat when I approached. Instead, it seemed to grow larger, more substantial, feeding on my attention and fear. I raised my phone to record, but the device flickered and died, its battery drained despite being fully charged when I went to bed. My flashlight began to dim, its beam growing weaker and more diffuse. The figure stepped forward, and I realized with growing horror that it wasn't moving toward me. It was expanding, filling the hallway with its presence, consuming the space between us. I turned to flee, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. The familiar landmarks of my home, the pictures on the walls, the decorative table, the bedroom door, all appeared to be sliding away from me, receding into a distance that shouldn't have been possible within the confines of my modest house. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, coming from everywhere and nowhere. They seemed to be calling my name, but in voices I didn't recognize, spoken in tones that human vocal cords couldn't produce. The sound penetrated my skull, bypassing my ears entirely and resonating directly in my brain. I stumbled forward, my legs weak and unsteady, desperate to reach the safety of my bedroom. But safety had become a relative concept. If these things could manifest in my hallway, what was to stop them from following me anywhere? What was to stop them from being there already, waiting in the darkness beside my bed? The seventh night arrived with a sense of inevitability. I knew, with the certainty of condemned man, that something fundamental was going to change. The pattern that had been building all week was reaching its culmination, and I was powerless to stop it. I didn't even try to resist the call of my bladder this time. I rose from bed mechanically, my movements automated, as if I were sleepwalking. The hallway was different now, longer, narrower, with walls that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. The air was thick with an almost palpable malevolence, and every step forward required enormous effort, as if I were walking through molasses. The figure was waiting for me at the bathroom door, but it was no longer alone. The other shapes I'd glimpsed in my peripheral vision throughout the week had solidified into a crowd of watchers, lining both sides of the hallway like a grotesque honor guard. They were all tall, all impossibly thin, all wearing the same void-like faces that revealed nothing and somehow conveyed everything. As I approached, they began to move, turning in unison to track my progress. The sound of their movement was like dry leaves rustling in a wind that existed only for them. They parted as I drew near, creating a path that led not to the bathroom, but to something else entirely. A doorway that hadn't been there before, opening onto a darkness so complete it seemed to have texture and weight. I knew I should turn back, should fight against whatever compulsion was driving me forward. But my body no longer felt like my own. I was a passenger in my own flesh, watching helplessly as I stepped through the impossible doorway and into the void beyond. The darkness swallowed me whole, and in that moment of complete sensory deprivation, I finally understood the truth. The figures, the whispers, the impossible geometry of my transformed house, none of it was real. None of it was happening. I was still in bed, had been in bed all along, caught in the grip of some form of sleep paralysis or waking nightmare. The realization should have been comforting, but instead it filled me with a terror more profound than anything I'd experienced during my week of midnight encounters. Because if none of this was real, if I was creating these elaborate hallucinations night after night, then what did that say about my mind? What did that say about my grip on reality? And most terrifying of all, if I could create such vivid, consistent delusions while asleep, how could I trust anything I experienced while awake? The clock beside my bed glowed softly in the darkness. 3 a.m. I could feel my bladder pressing against my consciousness, demanding attention. My body was already beginning to move, muscles preparing for the familiar journey down the hallway. But now I had to wonder, was I waking up, or was I still dreaming? Was the figure in the hallway real, or was it a product of my fractured psyche? And perhaps most disturbing of all, did it matter? The darkness beckoned, patient and eternal, offering answers I wasn't sure I wanted to know. But my body was already moving, already carrying me toward whatever waited in the shadows beyond my bedroom door. After all, some rituals must be completed, whether we understand them or not. The hallway stretched before me, familiar and foreign all at once, and I stepped forward into the waiting embrace of 3 a.m.